Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Our mainstream account tells us that in the earliest days of our civilization we built pyramids during the Bronze Age. After the Bronze Age, we slowly advanced to the time of the Roman Republic that eventually became the Roman Empire, and the sort of structures that we built changed radically. We advanced to building smaller structures that were not quite as geometrically precise as the earlier pyramids, and yet they're very fine structures with great domes and magnificent colossal forms to them that endure to this day. And let's also take time to appreciate the wondrous Roman roads, many of which that also continue to endure to this day. Everywhere we go around the land, we'll see the ruins of the previous civilization. And yes, that includes the United States and the Americas, even though it's called the New World. Although new as opposed to what is certainly a question of the day. Today we're going to examine the 5 eras theory. The channel originally started with the charter of examining numerous different theories. And you can go back and watch the video that's linked in the description of this video called The Grand Theories of Tartaria and the Old World, in which we explored the many different theories that could explain the existence of pre-existing civilizations that were not explained in the mainstream. Think about the aspect of a cemetery. You believe that a cemetery gives you validation that the history that you're told is accurate because every time someone you know passes away, they're buried in a cemetery with a date that's left on the tombstone. Therefore, older tombstones must be validation that what happened in the past historical account is accurate. Although would you be surprised to know that virtually every cemetery across the lands has been moved at some point in time for a variety of reasons. We have now advanced to building wondrous towers of glass and steel that cross the land. And yet, can we actually build these incredible pyramids that we did in the distant past during the Bronze Age? How does the mainstream account explain the construction of these pyramids? Indeed, we are derided for even questioning the account that we're given for how the pyramids were constructed. We are derided and told that it's merely a conspiracy theory. Yet at the same time, the mainstream tries to explain the pyramids with theories. In other words, they don't know for sure. But it's okay for them to come up with theories because their theories are validated by scientists, historians, archaeologists, and all the individuals with the appropriate credentials to do such things. So you look at the pyramids and you'll see that it's made up of many large stones that had to be moved. And they explain this by telling us that the quarries were nearby. They also have these wondrous images that we have that show human labor moving these great blocks. And then we have these beautiful animations that show us how they used a wonderful waterworks project to move these blocks and set them in place. And doesn't that illustration look great of those giant colossal people? And when you look at these illustrations and you have this wonderful account that tells you that water may have moved the blocks in place with human labor, it suddenly seems very believable, and you'll just accept it without asking questions. Of course, this image looks ridiculous. We could never build the pyramids like this today. So if we can't do it with human labor, and we base everything on this supposed representation from a governor of Egypt that existed 2,000 years before the year 0, or so we're told, and then it was some Greek individual who came up with a theory on how they moved the blocks using ramps, even though he was theorizing about an event that occurred 2,000 years before he was alive, and then this Greek individual is also 2,000 years before our current time, I don't see any issues with the mainstream account of the pyramids. Now, if you want a different theory, we're going to examine the 5 eras theory. The 5 eras theory examines the fact that there are civilizations that came before ours that we don't discuss, that the mainstream does not acknowledge. And the reason for that being is that because if you actually acknowledge the existence of other civilizations where people lived in a different fashion, then it completely detracts from your ability to maintain your control over the population. The eras that we talk about the most and we'll examine on the channel are the contemporary era, our current era, the 5th era, and the 4th era, or also known as the Tartarian era or the Monument era. These are the most dramatic eras to talk about, and we also have the most evidence. But we're also going to consider the foundation eras, the 1st through the 3rd eras. And we call them the foundation eras because they were the original foundations that both the 4th era and the 5th era were built on top of. And we can still see their remnants. Indeed, we speculate that the pyramids are actually the remnants of the 2nd era civilization, or the foundation era. And yet there are other examples of incredible geometric structures that endure. Consider what we have in the 5th era with our great cities of glass and steel, and yet something about them seems very disposable and uninspired. What's the primary form of architecture? We have nothing but wonderful brutalist architecture. Brutalist architecture, called as such because it is functional, and it's also cost-effective. What's truly intriguing to consider, though, about the prospect of brutalist architecture is how it's risen across the world, and its heyday was considered after World War II in both the United States and the Soviet Union. And despite the fact that these were two diametrically opposed ideologies and nations, for a variety of reasons, they somehow embraced the same type of architecture, supposedly at different times and for different reasons that happen to support their respective economic systems. Even in Pittsburgh, where we saw the beautiful Cathedral of Learning, we have this wonderful glass tower that we can look at and we can act like it really compares with the Cathedral of Learning. And then we have many other wondrous structures where great residences live in. It looks nice and rounded and cubed and very, very boring. Sometimes you have to remember, though, that there is inspired architecture in brutalist architecture. It looks like we have what appears to be some sort of broken down TIE fighter here. And what does it represent? I don't know. Looking at the rest of the architecture, you need go no further than consider the dystopian film A Clockwork Orange. A Clockwork Orange, which talked about how a society repressed and controlled an individual, and it used this architecture quite effectively to show how individuals were controlled and how ultimately the violence that was inflicted on others was all at the behest of the government. And if you pay attention to the subtext in the movie A Clockwork Orange, you'll see that the architecture plays no small part in representing that. And there's no doubt about it that brutalist architecture can certainly reflect a dystopian flavor to a society, if you will. Now, is this going a little too far? Is this being a little too harsh on brutalist architecture? It has its place, it's functional, and it's cheap. At least that's what we'll be told. Although there are conflicting accounts given as to why it was embraced. For example, you'll be told that in the Western world, the United States, brutalist architecture was embraced because it was cheaper, and there was a demand for residences. And then in the Soviet Union, or the so-called communist bloc at the time, you'll be told that brutalist architecture was embraced because it was all for the good of the state, and it was for allowing individuals and workers to all have the same standard of living. And as much as we believe both of these diametrically opposed ideologies embracing the exact same architecture as the main reason for why we have numerous examples of brutalist architecture, we see that it represents the Fifth Era. And in fact, many offshoots of what they used to call brutalist architecture still exist to this day. And you need look no further in the United States than a Holiday Inn Express or any of these newer modern hotels or residential areas, where you can find that it's not really dystopian living, it's merely common sense. It makes perfect sense. It's cheaper. And it's always good to have disposable buildings. It's also good to have buildings with the fine functional lines of brutalism in the background for when you're engaging on your individual walks for fun. But why is brutalist architecture considered something that's an advancement? For two reasons. One, we're told that it reflected the economic realities in the entire world from the 1950s to the 1970s. And two, we're just told that it's a lot more practical. We don't want to build architecture that has an artistic appeal to it. Practicality, cost savings, and being economically viable. That's what really matters. And when you have a lot of people that need housing, you're going to shove them in very block-like housing units that all look the same. And this will inspire people. And indeed, the actual housing units that were used to film A Clockwork Orange still have that same dystopian look to them in the present. Now, it's my opinion. Perhaps this is a utopian appearance to you. Perhaps you think that that beautiful Freedom Tower in New York City is an improvement over the structures that preceded it. We've looked at the skyline of New York City in the early 20th century. And tell me, is there a comparison? Do any of these many residential high-rises actually compare to the previous residences that we had all over the Western world and the Eastern world from the times past? We'll be told that this was merely a necessity, that this was done for the good of people, that this represented the will of the people, not just in the United States, but in the Soviet Union. Now let's look at the Art Deco question. Is Art Deco from the Fifth Era or the Fourth Era? Art Deco is very intriguing because it has conflicting accounts for what it really represents. It has conflicting accounts for what styles actually go into Art Deco. When we look at Art Deco, though, we see something very different than brutalist or postmodern. We see an architectural style that reflects artistic inspiration, something that reflects a civilization that genuinely cares about the structures that it's building, that the structures are supposed to have more of a function than just be utilitarian, as we're relentlessly told that brutalist architecture serves. We see a style and a beauty in these Art Deco buildings that seem to speak to the human spirit. When you look at these buildings, you can't help but be impressed, and you feel that a lot more effort was put into their exterior and interior designs. You actually see the fact that there is the true human spirit that's reflected in these buildings. And oftentimes people will try to convince you that these buildings were all easily built primarily in the United States during the 1920s, and you can even find a great example of one built in the Soviet Union in the 1940s to the early 1950s. Yet, looking at the Art Deco style, you can see that there is something about it that is always awe-inspiring. And it's very difficult to accept the explanation that all these buildings were built with these very wonderful and convincing construction photos that we have. And even though this was only about 100 years ago, it still falls in a very ambiguous time. Did our civilization build these buildings? Or are we simply told that they built these buildings? How much of a deception do we have with the actual timeline? And can we really validate or verify anything? Now, it's very interesting to me because since I've done many of these explorations and we've primarily looked at many cities in the United States, we've started to look at cities in Europe and in Asia, we always have the same explanation and always have the same things that you see in the comments. And I'm going to let you in on something. There's actually a comment somebody could make that would convince me over 90% that any one of these Art Deco buildings were built by our civilization. But it's quite fascinating that not a single person has ever made that comment. And it's really quite simple, and I'm not going to tell you what that comment is. I'll let you know if somebody makes the comment, but you can find an example of it in one of the videos concerning an Iowa exploration because somebody made a comment that very convincingly showed that the 801 Grand Building in Des Moines was built by our civilization. And yet there's so many questions that come up with these Art Deco buildings. They continue to show the aspect of the civilization that preceded ours. I believe that by and large, most of these structures are from the 4th era, or the Tartarian civilization that preceded our 5th era. And why do I think that? Because these buildings do reflect the style of what we would call the Old World. They have that artistic spirit, that inspiration in every single one of them. And it's not just on the exteriors of the buildings, it's also in the interior where you see how they reflect the once grandeur of civilization. A civilization that cared about the individual, not constantly being in a state of function or a state of misery, but being able to inspire the spirit on the inside. No doubt when you're in an Art Deco building as opposed to when you're in a brutalist architecture building, you can tell the difference. You can also compare and contrast how you feel when you stand outside an Art Deco building as opposed to a brutalist building. And when you see some of the examples of Art Deco, the explanation you'll be given from architects is that they had more of an artistic flair in the 1920s to incorporate all these incredible styles that even include Egyptian, strangely enough, because we do recall the Civil Courts building in St. Louis that we looked at that was modeled after the mausoleum of Helicanarsis, which supposedly doesn't have anything to do with Egypt, but it does. And that's according to the mainstream account. There's always these beautiful reliefs that also accompany Art Deco. The wondrous figures that you see depicted on the outside of the buildings. And these buildings have many different functions. Some are office buildings, some are municipal buildings, some are memorials, yet the style is reflected in the same. And while they try to tell us exactly what it's supposed to reflect, and of course they give us the hand wave explanation that the reason it reflects every civilization and culture across the world is because, of course, it incorporates every civilization and culture across the world. That's how you explain Art Deco. It's not because it's actually from a civilization that encompassed all the known lands. It's because somebody was trying to achieve cultural understanding in the 1920s, especially in the United States. The interiors of some of these buildings continue to inspire us. Now, why do I acknowledge the fact that some of these buildings may be questionable? Because we constantly run across the situation where we're told, we are assured in the same manner with repeated statements that many of these buildings, and here we look at the main building of the Moscow University, a questionable building, we're told that this individual, Joseph Stalin, was responsible for its construction. And once Joseph Stalin had passed on, then the Soviet Union completely embraced brutalist architecture. Indeed, it's an individual that we always explain it. Remember during the Kansas City exploration where we saw some very stunning Art Deco buildings, including the Power and Light building in the aptly named Power and Light District within Kansas City. I would be interested to see someone actually be able to build a building like this today. I would like to see someone build this very impressive theater that still endures with this very unique dome, again in Kansas City, interesting patterns that we see in the windows, and of course the type of construction material that was used to establish the walls and the dome itself.
One of the most peculiar details we have about maps is the fact that they have to be altered, changed, in order that they might be used to conduct proper navigation. Yet changing these maps also leads to different projections that vastly changes the scale of the continents. Other projections can also change not only the vast scale of the continents, but also showing that we have one ocean. Is this an accurate map? Does this map enable us to see other lands beyond? Is it possible that there is a true map of the realm that we don't actually see? One of the questions that I've been asked numerous times by viewers, some channel members, and even people that I encounter in my day-to-day life, and yes, I do encounter some interesting characters in my day-to-day life, is there a true map that really represents everything that we have in the lands? Is it out there somewhere? What does it really look like? Well, I thought I would give you the best answer to that question in this particular exploration. Now, you may recall live stream when we looked at the Unknown Lands Part 2, I had some strange maps that I displayed. And one of my favorite ones, of course, shows Hyperborea being at the very center of the land, or the top of the globe, however you want to see it. Remember, I'm not so specific about that. And I think I've explained why on many occasions, why I'm not so specific about the shape of the land. There seems to be something, how shall we say, that's very programmed when it comes to the shape of the land. So by all means, you believe what the shape of the land is and what you really want to believe it, and you believe it for whatever reason. I will always ask, though, have any of us actually been in a position where we have the true perspective to see the shape of the lands? Well, the answer is no. Unless, of course, those astronauts are telling the truth. That's always a possibility, and I don't discount anything. However, if that is the case, why is it, how shall we say, somewhat ambiguous to have follow-on images? Well, perhaps it's because of all the limitations that they tell us, and that's all the truth. I know that's not what we think here, but anyways, on to what the real answer is, or at least what I theorize the answer is. Is there a map that shows us the shape of the lands? Well, these are the maps that we tend to encounter and we spend a lot of time on. And these various maps, for what we understand, they do show the shape of the lands that we see. And they do tend to reflect what we expect them to be. Now, one of the questions I may ask, and I'll ask you, and when I say I may ask, it's when I'm in conversation with the people I encounter in day-to-day life. Did you see the recent disaster movie Greenland, apocalyptic movie? And one of the questions about that film is, do you recall the scenery that they had of Florida when, the asteroid struck Florida? And they were showing live footage, satellite imagery, and video that displayed the entire panhandle of Florida. Very, very well rendered too. Now, granted, this was in a movie. And the question I would ask, and I'll ask you now, do you ever see any sort of imagery or video that shows you large-scale sections of land like that? I'm just asking the question, have you ever seen it? Or is it only available in that movie? Now, would we see something that shows all of Europe? Well, purportedly we have images and video that do show it, even though it's, let's just say it's not as well rendered as it was in the film Greenland. Maybe there's a reason for that. But can you even find even closer aerial imagery or video that shows you Sicily and the boot of Italy? These are just questions I'm asking you. Again, I'm not leading you to any conclusions, just asking you to think about all this. And so with these other maps, we see these examples. Of course, we have the ancient map of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and the three continents known at that time. And naturally, this was the map that Eratosthenes was using when he calculated the near correct circumference of the Earth. So there's yet another discrepancy. There's all these discrepancies with all this when you start to tear these accounts apart. And of course, during the exploration, I was on the account of Hyperboreans, but for this one, really examining the shape of the land. Why do we have so many versions during the age of exploration, the age of discovery, when, as we understand it with the official history, the world was truly the uncharted lands? Why are there so many versions? Why do some show California as an island? Why do others not show California as an island? Why do some show the Great Lakes in North America and others don't show any Great Lakes or a single lake with an island in the middle of it? That's just one continent. There are numerous other discrepancies with the other continents. I'm just talking about the most well known. And then, of course, we have other odd displays of these maps, such as this one, with this very interesting clock here. And yet, oddly enough, and I didn't talk about this in the live stream because, there might be difficulties. And I'm not talking, of course, about interacting with the audience. I'm talking about other difficulties, if you follow me. But I'll point this out to you, Prime Explorers. You notice that this goes from Roman numeral 1 all the way to Roman numeral 12. And then you notice this goes from Roman numeral 1 all the way to Roman numeral 12. It seems like your classic 24-hour clock, day and night, right? And then there's alterations for when you have light and when you have dark, depending on where you are in the land and what season it is. And of course, you can accept the mainstream explanations for why that is so, or there's alternate explanations that you can accept. But it's rather odd that there has never been a single unified display like this that's easily available that can give you better projections. It's also rather odd that even after all this time of all these observations, we don't have more efficient clocks. We don't have more efficient calendars. And we're stated that's because there's limitations with how accurate they can be, and so on and so forth. Once again, a series of reasons given for why modern technology, artificial intelligence, all the other wondrous things that we have can't give us the answer. There's limitations, or so we're told. And then, of course, the discrepancies with the arrangement of Greenland, something else that we noticed, and, of course, the appearance of islands that are no longer there. And the official explanation will be, well, those cartographers were fools, or they simply didn't know what they were doing, or the individuals who really went out and sailed and charted these lands were mistaken. But the question I'll ask you, and we'll come back to it, is just think of this. If this map was proven to be mistaken with subsequent explorations, subsequent sailors, mariners that went out there and said, no, there's no Friesland out there. No, Greenland's not oriented west to east. It's more south to north, or north to south, or however you want to say it. And it's a lot closer to Canada. And there's no land up there. It's all just a frozen pile of ice. It's just an ice ocean. That's all it is. Then don't you think that the monarchs, or their descendants, or the same nations, would do something about the fact that, yes, we had once published maps such as this, but they were incorrect. And here's official statements that they were incorrect. And we've had the cartographers, or their descendants, punished appropriately. At least that's what we would expect. But you look at all these maps and you see so many different examples and you see so many discrepancies in all of them. But yet there was never a single retraction by anyone for anything, oddly enough. Now, what do I mean by retraction? There was never an official statement that these maps were incorrect. During the time, I mean, of course, after the 1800s and in the 1900s, we understand that these maps are incorrect. But are we just going to take that at face value? Or is there a possibility that all these different maps that we look at have a completely different account to them? That maybe every single one of these maps, when they were actually charted, were absolutely correct. For example, you have this very interesting landmass all the way over here. Oh, it's just New Zealand. Yeah, that's not New Zealand. There's no way you could see that as New Zealand. Well, it's Australia, and that's New Zealand right there. Are you sure? I mean, these are the kind of things that we talk about, and yet we have land plotted at very precise coordinates on this particular map. And, of course, this is one of the maps that does not feature the Great Lakes, but it does feature the great city of Shilaga. Yes, I still have comments on that exploration where people say, it's Montreal, you just can't read a map. Well, and then I respond with, which map? There are more versions of maps of the land than there are versions of the Bible. So, as I'm fond of saying, make of it what you will. But what do I mean by all these maps actually having something that's correct about them, or being correct in the moment? I ask you to consider the possibility that all these maps were correct when they were made, that these were the actual observations that were what they really saw with their eyes, the explorers who saw these lands. Now, are these maps that were actually from the end of the Fourth Era, or are these the early maps from the Fifth Era? I am under the mindset that pretty much anything we have that gives us maps of the land, for the most part, we are seeing a lot of maps that are probably from the Fifth Era, and the early portion of the Fifth Era. Now, does it give the impression that there was something that survived from the end of the Fourth Era that became the baseline for the maps of the Fifth Era? Yes. But it really becomes problematic. It becomes problematic to know for sure because if something is obscured, we have no way of knowing for sure. I have no way of knowing for sure. But this map here, in this particular area, location undisclosed. Yes, I can't share it with you on a Prime Explorer video either. But just let me assure you, it's a very exotic and amazing location. And in this particular map, you see one of the most interesting layouts of the land. You see Drake's Passage, or the Strait of Magellan, truly as a passage or a strait, almost as a canal. And it's connected with the land to the quote-unquote south, or however you want to think of it as. But what I'm going to ask you, shape of the realm or shape of the land not being considered, is there more accuracy in this particular map? As it does show lands up at the North Pole. In fact, it does show the Great Magnetic Rock, the Black Rock, the Black Fortress, whatever you want to call it. But what's it really alluding to? And I'll point out some other details that I did not point out during the live stream about this particular unique location. There's some very interesting works of art. We've got a naked guy with a lion in a headlock. We've got some larger human beings with some cherubs subduing or raining down some horses. Very interesting. We have a guy attacking some odd creatures over here with a club. And we have satyrs depicted everywhere you look. And of course, the very elaborate cartouche symbol here. And then what's within it. By the way, in an upcoming exploration, I found a cartouche that actually has something much more terrifying within it. And you see what that cartouche could also be interpreted as. So, continuing on with our symbolism exploration. And other odd creatures that don't really make a lot of sense. Although this is a mixture of images, some seeming more benign and some seeming more disturbing when you look closer. And obviously I didn't want to push it with some of the elaborate possibilities with the meaning of these images on the live stream. But I'm letting you see them now. Such as this interesting apparition, again in a cartouche device. Very, very odd, isn't it? What are they really showing us here? Why do we have such a mixture of what seems to be good and evil? I suspect, and I really wish I could reveal this location, I think some of you know this location, but that this is one of the surviving locations that this map actually was made towards the tail end of the Fourth Era. That this might have been one of the last constructions of the Fourth Era, before things really fell apart. And that's really what they were trying to show in some of this artwork. Because think about it. If you have an entire worldwide civilization that not only speaks a completely different language, perhaps they had a completely different method of communication, and they could at least understand that the next humans that would come along would not be able to understand the language or have a means of being communicated to. And who knows how far they reached in technological ascendancy. I mean, if our civilization was suddenly to fall, and all this digital information that's on the internet is still out there, would a new civilization be able to access it, or would it be lost? Oddly enough, our good friend Carl Sagan actually posited this in Cosmos. And so, if that's indeed what we're looking at, then what's really the enigmatic statement about all these maps? What's the conclusion? Is what we're looking at here a true world map?
Well, I'm going to let you in on something, and this is not something I could show. But outside of this particular room, and going on down the hall, there's about 9 other exact maps in terms of layouts just like this. And yet there's differences within the land. Some do show the Great Lakes. Some show the island of California. Some don't show land in the north. Others do. Yes. Now, you have to take my word for it, and, if you want to completely think that I'm a liar, that's totally fine. You're well aware of the fact that there are many different versions of maps that we've already looked at that do show all these discrepancies. And as the saying goes, okay, so we've got maps that show different layouts of the land with different details. Some have islands and others don't. So what? And so what's the answer? What is the true map of the land? Well, here's one of the most definitive clues or hints: the enduring mystery of the Fool's Cap Map of the world. The full meaning of the 16th century illustration may never be understood. Actually, it may. Now, you may have seen this map before, and I strongly advise that you look at it yourself. It's quite intriguing. You'll notice it does seem to match closely to some of the other maps that we've looked at. And the symbol of the jester, joker, or fool is inspired thrones, playing cards, and comedic fart acts. But there's one particular image of the king's fool that has remained a true mystery among cartographers and historians. And in the graving, colloquially referred to as the Fool's Cap Map of the world, the intricate bust of a court jester, complete with bells and bauble, includes a face showing the world as it had been charted in the 16th century. And so that's what we have here, a charted map from the 16th century. And this is what we know about the map. Measuring about 14 inches by 19 inches and printed with a copper plate engraving, researchers estimate that the map dates between 1580 and 1590. So they have no clue. That's because it matches the oval map projections, the Ortelius map projections, and I've heard that pronounced 5,000 different ways. So by all means, if you know a better way to pronounce it, let me know. You know how I like caring about pronunciations. The Fool's Cap Map of the world isn't the first time the world has been visually mocked by a gesture. And of course, they try to attribute it to the various cartographers at the time and who was jailed for judiciary astrology. Interesting that they jailed somebody for that in the 1500s, and they know about that very specifically, but they don't know who actually composed this map. Yes. And they state that they believe that they know who composed the map, but they do correctly conclude that it's created an array of deep and dark interpretations of the world. I wonder why. The shoulder belts medallions include various proverbs, including, "Oh, the worries of the world." Traditionally, the fool was one of the only people who could freely criticize the monarchy. Well, why on earth is that? Can fools freely criticize the government today? I leave that to you to decide. Some academics have thus interpreted that the map was created as a commentary on the inaccuracy of depictions and charts of the world in an age where much of it had yet to be thoroughly documented and discovered. Yes. Maps of this era were even known to be altered visually to support certain political ends. Now, isn't that intriguing? This author, and indeed many people out there, are well aware of the fact that this did occur in the past, that things were altered to support certain political ends. So I will just ask the question that I always ask every single day, and I never get a good answer to every single day. If maps, and many, many other things, could be altered in any way to support certain political ends, then why not the official account of history? Why would that not be altered to support certain political ends? Well, because it's very well documented that even tyrants such as Napoleon support the honest pursuit of true history and scientific objectives. And I'm dead serious, that's the answer that you'll get. Anyways, one way of reading the image would suggest that all seemingly universal truths, all apparent trustworthy knowledge, or authoritative maps are partial and untrustworthy in that they conceal a hidden social ordering. Not to mention, they also conceal something else. They conceal the fact that no matter how good the cartographer is, they cannot actually compose or draw the full hidden map of the world. Others see a more melancholy outlook on the world. The Latin phrases inscribed on the jester's capstaff and shoulder belt lament the vanity of the world and the foolishness of those who love it.
Some might try to attribute that to the Gnostics. Of course, we can't ask any Gnostics because every single one of them were killed. On the staff is the phrase, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." And one of the medallions of the shoulder belt says, "Oh, the worries of the world." The quote on the bottom of the map sums up the message of the map. "The number of fools is infinite." That's probably one of the truest statements out there, isn't it? But yet, is it someone playing the fool, or is it someone being the fool? And if you really want to understand why the fool could criticize the monarchy, watch the film The Northman, which, fortuitously enough, the fool is portrayed by Willem Dafoe. I'm not kidding. The world is quite literally a foolish place. The uncomfortable truth told by this map is that the world is a somber, irrational, and dangerous place, and that life on it is a nasty, brutish, and short. Well, that's one way to look at it. But something else I want to go back to. If you look at different interpretations and other, how shall we say, esoteric information about maps, you may recall that one of the concepts that I've looked at many times is the Tesseract, or the fourth dimension. But I don't think I've ever actually explained how the fourth dimension really operates. And you look at this animated GIF here of the hypercube, as they call it, or the nested cube. The problem is, it's not an accurate representation. The reality is you can't accurately represent the fourth dimension and the third dimension, and really what you're looking at, and what I'm looking at right now, is the second dimension representation of the fourth dimension. There really is no cube within the cube. What it really is all this simultaneously coexists. Well, how exactly does that make sense? How can you have a cube within a cube? What does it really mean? Well, there's an entirely different way of looking at it. And oddly enough, this particular individual who is talking about actually mapping out the third dimension on the fourth dimension, or perhaps I should say visualizing the fourth dimension by mapping it onto the third dimension, using the Tesseract, of course. And you might recall that a classic cross, a two-dimensional cross, is folded up and it becomes the cube. In other words, the real nature of the world. Or does it? Because remember that we see the three-dimensional cross. And when you fold up the three-dimensional cross, you end up getting the Tesseract, or the hypercube. Now remember, that's just a representation. What does a hypercube really look like? Well, not just think of a hypercube. Think of a hypersphere. And what would a hypersphere really look like? Well, they do a decent job trying to depict it here, where they show the different spheres and the different lands actually being coexisting. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, they try to do it here, but again, you're limited. There's another way to look at it. Oddly enough, Steam Workshop probably has one of the best representations of it. And what they show is that each of the planes that make up this three-dimensional cross, imagine that each of these planes are a different map of the land. A different map made at a different time with the changing nature of the land. And yet, the reason that there's a change in nature of the land is that they all coexist. I know what I'm saying sounds relatively out there, but just stay with me for a moment. So just imagine that S is one map of the lands. A is another map of the lands. B is another map of the lands, and so on and so forth. And yet, it's possible that all of these different actual physical existences coexist at the same time. Now you're probably asking, well, how is that possible? It's possible if you were in the true fourth dimension, if the nature of our existence really is four-dimensional. Now I can't prove it, and there may be a lot of variations on it, but perhaps that's what was really understood by the last civilization. Perhaps they'd achieved that awareness and it was lost. And the Fool's Cat map was really just a little bit of a warning, or maybe they were even poking fun at realizing that the knowledge would be lost. Or maybe they didn't have a sense of humor at all, who knows? I have no idea what the society was like in the previous civilization. Or maybe that was their best way of trying to throw us a clue. Because you look at how these layers can actually be built upon one another and yet coexist. So then the question would be, okay, well, how do I jump from one layer to another? How do I go to the lands where there are no Great Lakes? Just an example. Or maybe I want to go to the lands where California is an island. Sounds like a nice place. And who knows? Maybe that California is operated a little better than the California that we have. I don't know. Just speculating. But if you really think about that, and you think about the concept of coexisting, are we talking about parallel realities? Or are we talking about something completely different? Are we talking about a much more malleable existence? In other words, our existence can suddenly change and shift. And this is how we can suddenly explain things such as the Mandela effect and all these other so-called psychological aberrations that we have relentlessly. I mean, if you look at this, plane of fire, plane of air. Think about the Terra Infinita map. What if it is possible that instead of all those lands being spread across a vast two-dimensional plane, they're really a much more limited plane, but they're unbounded? It sounds crazy, but yet it also seems to make a little bit of sense.
So, the time paradox, the recorder paradox, and historical revision. A lot of what guides this channel revolves around these three concepts. And what are these three concepts? Well, we'll start with the time paradox. Now, if you've been watching the channel, it was over a year ago that we released the exploration, the date paradox, or the time paradox. What year is it? Because you'll see it's clearly shown here on the thumbnail. It was 2023 when this was released. Is it really 2023? Is it currently 2024? The answer is, I don't know. I mean, do you know what year it is? I mean, are you confident in what year it is? How many different dating systems do we have? And how many different ways have we counted years over time? And why is that pertinent and relevant to what we do, especially with our historical explorations? And honestly, I'm asking right now, does anybody know what year it is? Anybody want to venture a guess? Are you confident that it's 2024? I mean, there's all kinds of historical conflicts on that one. Hey, Tracy, good to see you. Exactly, and it's one of those things that we tend to take for granted, and it's anybody and everybody. And one of the other questions that I'll run by you, and this is a good point here, Fairy Girl, we're definitely in a different year than the mainstream tells us. Can't say with impunity. Absolutely. But how many people embrace the fact that we can say with impunity? I had a feeling I was going to see 10 something. You know, I'm glad you bring that up, though. You know, whether you're venturing guesses there. Yeah, good one there, Brother Adam Bum. The 2112 Overture. Yeah, that's one of my favorite Rush songs, too. Hey, Chris, good to see you. But it's intriguing that it tends to be a 4-digit year, even though the mainstream loves to tell us how many years that we have. And so understanding and being aware of the fact that we really don't know what year it is critical to our understanding, because it's really the basic confidence trick. And if you think about it, who here in the entire land right now was alive to witness firsthand what we think of as the year 1899? Ah, yes, the secrets of forever time. And time functions just like distance. You can always impose more time and more distance when you need to explain something. So, great point on that one, Tracy. But there's more to it behind that, because time factors in with the when we look at the 5 W's behind anything and everything. And remember, we always look at the who, what, where, when, why. And then we ask the how. Although oftentimes the 5 W's are mixed up to confuse the how. What are the major indicators of truth? Well, here we have these images of city destruction, but yet I've imposed what the historical mainstream tells us happened with each of these photos. I mean, are they true? Or is it just a caption that went with them? Was this city destroyed by fire? Was this city destroyed by a random explosion? Was this city destroyed by the March of Sherman? So obviously it must be Atlanta, although there were many other cities in Georgia that were destroyed by Sherman, according to the mainstream account. And what about immigration? It all factors in, though. If we don't know what year it is, then how do we know exactly when these events occur? We have an idea, but how confident are we? And remember that question, was there anybody alive from 1899 who can tell us they witnessed these events firsthand? And of course, we focus on the 1800s because that's really the mystery century, as it were. But the 1900s is even more mysterious, especially the early 1900s, oddly enough. And yet we have people that lived through that. I always appreciate those comments where people tell me, well, my grandfather, my great-grandfather was alive during that time, so those events must have happened. Funny. I mean, I talked to my grandfather a lot, and he did live through the early to mid 1900s, and he could never tell me about any buildings or anything like that. But take it for what it is. Thanks, Albie. I appreciate that. I don't even know what day it is most of the time. Yeah, that's kind of how it goes for me too, Chassis. Hey, my bailiwick zone. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. Oh, there's a good one, Kathy. And a minor disparity right there. I mean, that's only 10 years difference, but you're right. There's different calendars. There's different dating systems. Ask somebody from China what year it is. Ask somebody from Israel what year it is. There's many different calendars and dating systems. And how many are we aware of? How many do we actively use? And then when you really want to throw confusion into this, imagine the fact that in the distant past, they were looking at different forms of dating. In other words, a season, or what we think of as a season, counted as a year. In some cultures, a month counted as a year. And then you have others with long count calendars, such as the Mayans. Now, did they really count a year the same way we did? We're assured that they did, but how do we know for certain? And now the recorder issue. So we talk about the time paradox, we understand the ambiguity of time, and now we go to the recorder paradox. So we have these professional historians, all these university omniscient know-it-alls, like unfortunately yours truly once used to be and now denies that, but the recorder paradox. So who's actually recording the events of history? Do historians record the events of history? These ruined cities always look like they've gone through a blitzkrieg. Yeah, blitzkrieg, carpet bombing, total saturation bombing. Yes, I use saturation loosely, but yes, it does look like there's all sorts of destruction. Does anybody know what film this image is from? And of course, I chose it very consciously. That's a good point there, Esma. Yes, January, February didn't originally exist. There were other months that were added too. The winners, yes, that's a good saying there, Peter, but, then you could ask the question, who are the winners? Yeah, the victor. The victors do. But was there really ever any conflict? At least conflict that we know of. I mean, what do we think of current conflicts? Do we have different victors? There you go. Yes, Marine. Yes, Doc Shelley. It's 1984. Do you know about the Chronovision? Well, let's come back to that, Albie. Let's come back to that. So, on 1984, this is actor John Hurt portraying the protagonist, Winston. Very fitting name, especially if you've looked at the recent. And I do keep up on the news headlines, although I'll admit I don't read too deep in the news. But anyways, you remember his job, Winston, the character in 1984. He was part of the Ministry of Truth, and what he did was he went through news articles and edited them to conform to the current nature of events. So what you had was a constant process of revision on all historical documents and all news, and that was his job. And remember that Winston was a member of the outer party. So really what we would think of in our society as the middle class. And channel members might recall our little author that we looked at a couple weeks ago who was going after the middle class, saying that they're the cause of all problems and they stole the American dream. Yes, very interesting novel. But in this particular story, whether you're talking 1984, the book, or any one of the numerous film versions, and they're all pretty good. I got to admit, though, the one they put out in 1984 was very, very fittingly dystopian. But he would edit the news. He would edit history. He would change pictures. He would change articles. He would change names. He would change affiliations and reported events. And this was in a constant process of revision. Or you could even say it's an ideological revolution that's occurring with every article he alters. Now, am I suggesting that there is a real-life Winston that's out there that's changing documents and news? No. You don't need to see it. You don't need that. This is an extreme example. But the idea of it is important. It's important to understand that perhaps our history, our understanding of the past, is a lot more malleable than we're led to believe. What are your thoughts on that? The AI has revised history. Yes, in some ways it has, and even references to the AI. He didn't die, but it was strongly implied he would die. Not to spoil it, but I guess you could say in a way he did die because, oh boy, did he really give in to what happened to him. Hey, Sky Sage, good to see you. Yes, like a fact checker and a wiki editor. Great example. Not quite to these same extremes, but we were informed that we have different news sources. We're informed that we have different nations with different purposes, different intentions, and so on and so forth. But do we? It's... Oh, there you go. Yes. Great comment there, Robert. History is like a living document. I would even go so far as to say history is a living document. It's constantly being changed. And the reason I bring up the whole concept of who's actually recording history, the historians do not record history in the moment, do they? Whether it's a person who's an actual recorder, the job of recorder, or typically government official, whatever government official is recording history. And you might recall, hey Chadwick, good to see you. You might recall that in one of our earlier explorations in one of the Iowa counties, they admitted that the official county records were kept by a judge in a shoebox. So yes, your shoebox documents. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Indeed. Whose story? Well, I guess it depends who's telling it in the moment, right, Jamie? Quantum eraser, changing the past to change the future. Yeah, in a lot of respects, that's exactly what's happening. Hey, PJC West, good to see you as well. So moving on, I thought I would introduce this idea of historical revisionism, critical re-examination of historical facts with or without new evidence. Now, the concept of historical revisionism was argued quite extensively when I was still with the university, because guess what? There's been a lot more historical revisionism, especially since the 2000s. And I don't think that's a controversial comment to make, because it seems to have accelerated. Now, is that to say it didn't happen in the 1900s? No, it happened in the 1900s. I guess you could say the process just seems to have been refined, and in a very insidious way, because it always seems like everyone's always acting in the nature of doing what is for the greater good, but then you have to ask the greater good of who. By the way, why can you do historical revision without new evidence? What would be a reason? What's an example of someone doing historical revision without new evidence? Good question. More on that later. Keep that thought in mind, though, because we're definitely going to look at it. Watch it in real time with the American media. Yeah. And now they've got the process down to where they can change it every day or every hour. Reverse course. Oh, we got something else to tell you. Reverse course. I saw the Catacomb of Paris and the Last Supper woke parody in the Paris Olympic ceremony. Isn't that weird? Yeah, I'm going to come back and take a look at that. There's weird stuff going on, although I'm under the mindset now that they're just throwing that into every opening Olympic ceremony because, they've got to obfuscate what they've already shown in the past. So. Hey, Polly, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Ah, yes. Great way to say it, too, Esma. Social issues. And oddly enough, that's been going on since the 1900s, and it's very easy to document that, or at least have a hint that that's what's going on, that they're constantly revising history in the name of social issues. Hey, Tara, good to see you. Aloha. Well, and good point on Wikipedia. Think about that, because prior to the advent of Wikipedia, everybody relied on their encyclopedias. Now, whether that was Encyclopedia Britannica or one of the Time Life series or whatever, you had your fixed books there, and that's what you would refer to, and that's what you'd go off of. But now you have a true living document. Referencing what Robert said earlier, you've got an online document that can very easily and subtly be changed. Hey, Sovereign, Invisible, and Traceable, thanks for joining us. Yes. And it really was like opening the tunnel. So, I have not seen the film one by one. I'll have to check it out, Jamie. Don't let me forget about that, so... But back on the concept of historical revisionism, it is an official policy within history departments. It is accepted that historical revision needs to happen. Now, how legitimate is it? Well, that's what we're going to discuss. Because some people believe that historical revisionism is the reinterpretation of a historical account or narrative based on actual facts and authenticated evidence. That's what we used to be told. So you had to have new facts and new evidence. You couldn't just change a historical account.
But now you have what they call historical distortion, when historical accounts or narratives are changed to suit a quote-unquote personal agenda. Yeah, sure, it's a personal agenda. It involves disinformation and lies to change history. So, does it really seem like someone is concerned about maintaining an objective historical account, or can someone really change a historical account to suit whatever point they want to make? Or maybe they have a purpose behind it. Maybe there's a reason to keep everyone confused, because what do we like to say when people are confused? They tend to defer to what more when they're confused? I think if you've been on the channel, you've heard me say this a few times. Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if we could just get the truth? You know, I'm all about it too. But everybody's got to machine gun you for trying to get the truth, or just the facts. I mean, what are the facts? Facts are what I say they are, and that's what a lot of people will tell you. They won't say it like that, but they'll come across with that kind of confidence. And that's one of the hardest things to look for. Exactly. Response is, you're crazy usually. Why are you even questioning it? And it's a good point, Bad Wolf, and that's what a lot of people will say. Yes, especially if you go off of the Thomas Hobbes mentality of it, because the book Leviathan, which I strongly recommend anybody who's looking to understand how governments operate in the Fifth Era or our current era, just read Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes lays it out, and he says it very clearly, what governments are really all about. It's no conspiracy. They need to have that control. Anarchy is bad. It's really bad. Yes, indeed. So it's important to understand, though, the difference of these ideas, because historical revisionism is something that's embraced and used by the mainstream, but then they still keep the idea open of historical distortion. So really, authority. Authority decides what's legitimate revision and what's distortion. Now, they do give you an idea of what are some of the impacts of revisionism on society. It erases marginalized voices. Oh, that's true. Distorts the truth. Absolutely true. Undermines democracy. Well, we know what country this one came from. You know, the country that loves to talk about democracy but hates to practice it. Oh, did I just say that out loud? Yeah, I did. And promotes intolerance. So, oddly enough, in this little diagram, we do see a lot of truth of the impact of revisionism or distortion or whatever you want to call it today on society. It does erase marginalized voices. It does distort the truth. It does promote intolerance, and it'll undermine any sort of confidence in government, whether you have a republic, a democracy, or I've been waiting for this one, a pseudo-republic or pseudo-democracy. Anyways.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
In the Five Eras theory, we spend a lot of our exploration time between the Fourth and the Fifth Era, and this is because we have the most remaining evidence. We have to consider that the Fourth Era, or the civilization that preceded ours that we call Tartaria on this channel, had advance warning of the pending collapse of their civilization and their society. And indeed, looking closely at the Fourth Era timeline itself, we see in the three phases the final phase concluded with its decline and fall. They clearly knew that their civilization was falling. Now, they may not have known the exact details behind it any more than we do, but we have suspicions. It was a conflict, it was some sort of calamity, a disaster, a flood, a deluge, plasma rain, many different theories as we do see these examples across the land. And yet somehow the civilization did know that they were falling, and they no doubt took precautions to try to facilitate the survival of many individuals within their society. But one dark question that we have to consider is, was the civilization operating on the same mentality that it was earlier, or had it been infiltrated by the forces that they were indeed engaged in conflict against? We have evidence for both, but we see that when a civilization's falling fast, your best option is to design and build survival compounds. And even though we're looking at a state hospital, we see that this state hospital has a powerhouse, a bakery, a warehouse, a laundry, a carpenter shop, and what they considered an occupational therapy building, but is no doubt some sort of workshop that was repurposed. So consider this. While this may be what we see as a hospital, it had all the details needed for a survival compound, a compound that is off the grid, has the capability to sustain human beings, has the ability to generate its own power, has the ability to provide food and sustenance, and yet live off the grid. Now, we don't know exactly what details they were facing with the disaster. It's clear they were aware that their society was about to collapse and they were going to be cut off. And as we've seen in a lot of post-apocalyptic literature, we see that having these compounds, such as the compound in Mad Max 2 or the Road Warrior, as it's known as in the United States, we find many examples of what these compounds are. elaborate structures that took a lot of effort. Some were clearly built better than others. Now we know what many of these structures would become once the Fifth Era civilization arose. They would be repurposed into many different institutions that we consider asylums, whether they're asylums for people we're told were mentally ill, soldiers' asylums, orphanages, and even universities, civic centers. They've been repurposed into many different things. But keep the perspective that we're in the Fourth Era and we're actually looking at these structures and the challenge that they faced. It's clear that some were built better than others. Some they had a little bit more time to plan out and put a little bit more effort. And we're certainly not aware of what their actual construction techniques were, or how long it would have taken them to actually erect one of these structures. Perhaps they could have done it in a very short amount of time. But we do see a variance in the quality of construction and also the number of buildings. For example, this isolated asylum in Kansas no doubt could have been an effort by the locals at the time, at the end of the Fourth Era, to try to establish some sort of survival building, and that's why we see some that are isolated. Or perhaps the subsidiary buildings were torn down or lost over time. The reason we have so much evidence, though, with these compounds is that you tend to see a large group of old world buildings that are all kept together. And this suddenly explains all these asylums and the well-constructed main building that they have, along with all the subsidiary buildings, having their own power source, their own ability to live off the grid, generate food, water, and sustain people for an indefinite period of time. Many are also geographically isolated. And because of that, that's probably the reason why we could say that they were originally intended to be survival compounds. They knew that their society was collapsing. They didn't know exactly what they were facing, though. Was it this adversary that we've posited in other explorations that the Fourth Era civilization was facing? Or did they even know that they were going to face some sort of terrifying natural calamity? Were they aware of some sort of plasma rain, or the very nature of the land changing in ways we can't imagine? Most of our current experiences with our literature always talk about surviving nuclear destruction. But perhaps this society faced something very different. And you could make the argument that a lot of these compounds are not very defensible. But perhaps they're not defensible from the weapons that we think of. Another disturbing question that we don't often consider is, if direct firearms and firearms are considered the greatest weapons, then why are we allowed to have them so freely? Perhaps there are other sorts of weapons out there that are far more terrifying, far more destructive, and yet at the same time far more controlled in the application of their destructive capability. Think about that with the different types of destruction that we've seen, widespread and yet some very localized. Back to the concept of the reset compounds, though, we still have many of these facilities all over the land, and we have explored them very extensively. Many were initially repurposed to become our lunatic asylums in the 1800s, or the time frame after we believe the reset really occurred. Although we don't know for sure, there seems to be a lot of evidence that there were many of these compounds that were remaining, they were fully intact, and then they already happened to be geographically isolated. So, as they were imposing the plan of conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination for the Fifth Era civilization, these former reset compounds that ironically facilitated survival were now going to be repurposed as concentration camps, as exclusion camps to send people who were not properly assimilating into this new civilization of the Fifth Era. Or in more direct terms, they were not accepting the fact that things had changed and that they had a different knowledge and awareness of a previous civilization. So they were sent to these former survival compounds that were now repurposed as insane asylums, as they were called, eventually changed to the more gentle name of mental hospitals as years went on, but ultimately serving the same purpose. And indeed, we can see that in our recent history, it wasn't until the 1970s, the 1980s, relatively recently, that the original purpose and function of these mental hospitals was finally dropped. And yet you can see with the variance in construction when we look at different mental hospitals, some are more well constructed than others. Others seem to have the same geometric precision on their interiors. And this is not something we'd expect to see in the 1800s, even for what is supposed to be an altruistic Kirkbride plan that was designed to facilitate the mental health and well-being of all the patients that were sent there. And indeed, you might recall when we did our explorations, we found that there was any slew of reasons going down to not liking someone as being an acceptable reason to have someone committed to a mental asylum in the 1800s. But looking at some of the other structures, and now that we consider that these are actually survival compounds and seeing the variance in construction, this suddenly explains this. This explains the fact that we do have this variance in construction. It seems that some were more prioritized and they had a little bit more detail put into the architecture. They also seem to have been more well equipped with some of what we would call antiquitech, or power generation capability. It seemed as though they possessed different aspects of power generation, as though there were redundancies that were factored into these survival compounds. And again, this all makes sense because of the fact that you need these survival compounds to stand up to all sorts of different challenges, all sorts of different considerations. But when you look at them, you can see that they have all the aspects of the hints of technology that we've seen in many of the other old world buildings that we've explored that still remain in the cities. But you really have to consider this aspect that these survival compounds were geographically isolated. So it gives the impression, it gives us many clues that the previous civilization was facing many different threats. There was clearly an existential threat that was threatening them in their main population centers. And so it seems that the population had to disperse to try to facilitate their survival. And this is reflected in many of the post-apocalyptic literature that we've seen. And you can even find it in the whole concept of fallout shelters, survival compounds, and even to this day with the survivalist mentality. Now, I'm not conducting this exploration to try to say that we're going to figure out when the next reset's going to happen or anything like that, and that we should panic. We're simply looking for what happened in the past to develop a better awareness. And then it's up to all of us as individuals with what we're going to do with that awareness. But I believe that the theory that these compounds were originally survival compounds to get the last civilization survivors through the reset makes a lot more sense than some other purpose for these buildings. Now, it is possible that these buildings or portions of these compounds did have a very different purpose when they were originally constructed in the Fourth Era civilization, and then they were repurposed to be survival compounds. So think about that. Let's just take this St. Elizabeth's Hospital, for example. Originally it was constructed as something akin to a hotel in the Fourth Era civilization. They knew that the downfall of their civilization was coming rapidly, so they repurposed it to a reset compound. Because it was well constructed and it had a lot of the infrastructure to survive the reset. After the reset, it was then repurposed again into a hospital and an asylum. And indeed, we can take this to the final conclusion where some of these mental asylums are even being repurposed back into hospitals in our current civilization. So consider this. These buildings are so well built, so well constructed, that they're able to survive all sorts of calamities. They're able to survive vast changes within what they face in their environment, and they're able to survive existential threats. We don't exactly know what sort of weapons were available and used towards the end of the Fourth Era, but it seems clear that there was all sorts of different types of destructive weapons that could cause the complete collapse of buildings even built as well as this. And yet we can still see some newer examples of construction and architecture, and perhaps these are the structures that were built in a more hasty manner to try to facilitate the survival of the survivors of the Fourth Era civilization. The other more disturbing aspect, though, when we consider the fall of the Fourth Era civilization, is that these asylums were all over the land. Every single major continent has some form of asylum or some form of large compound. A compound typically being built around a large main administration building. And indeed, when you look at asylums in the United States or across the land, you'll always notice that they seem to have an old main building. Many universities and old colleges have the old main building. It's the central building on the compound. It's the main administration building. Or perhaps it was originally the command center for the survival compound. It's going to be your best constructed building. It's going to be your most defensible building. Now you may be thinking, okay, but not from the firearms perspective. But as I said, perhaps they had entirely different considerations than firearms. If they had some sort of sound-based technology, if there was some reason to establish a standoff in the terrain or be isolated, we have to think along those lines. Now, again, it's all theories, could be completely incorrect about this. But it is rather strange that we have so many of these compounds that are very definitive old world buildings. And it's not just the main building, but many of the supporting buildings are also old world buildings. That we have examples of the fact that these are true survival compounds, and that's the way they were originally intended. And indeed, many seem to have been built from the ground up, the very start, to be survival compounds. I'm reminded of the entire concept of the vaults in the Fallout universe, and if you've never played the Fallout games, it's a post-apocalyptic. It was originally a PC game from the 1990s, based and inspired on the Mad Max concept. And what we saw was civilization knew they were facing a nuclear war, or their version of a reset, and so their means to survive it included constructing underground vaults. Now, on that note, I'm well aware that most of these facilities we're looking at are above ground, but we can see exactly how isolated they are, such as this one in Cherokee, Iowa, one of the most geographically isolated asylums that we've seen until you go out into the west where it's even more isolated. But if you think along those concepts about the fact that many of these large compounds are built in essentially the middle of nowhere, and if their intention was indeed to survive, many different forces trying to eradicate the remaining population, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. Now, we do know, and we just explored many catacombs underneath the major cities across the land, not just in the United States, and so it seems as though there was an underground and above ground component for this. Now, in a more insidious note, could it have been possible that there were people who were taken into these compounds, and much as we saw in the plot line of the Fallout series, the vaults were actually not truly for the survival of people. They were merely to take people to experiment on them in many different sort of crazed social and medical experiments. And yet, ironically, we'd also see that these compounds, once they are repurposed into asylums, that's exactly the function that they served. And so what it gives us a clue towards is that perhaps the Fourth Era civilization, their leaders, their administration, had already been infiltrated by the forces that they were battling. And indeed, we suspect that's the reason for their collapse. When you look at how well constructed the compound, or the mental asylum, or the hospital as it's known now in Cherokee, Iowa truly is, while considering how isolated this location truly is, it gives many different clues to what was going on. We can see that there was some very definitive effort put into its construction. It was to survive a long time, and it still stands to this day, the entire structure and the entire compound. And yet the geographical isolation, it's a terrifying concept to imagine a scared population facing their extermination, trying to seek solace. And yet when we see the many fortresses and many of the hasty efforts that still exist to this day, that we know would do no good against an invading army, because an invading army could simply isolate them and engage in siege warfare and starve out the population. Unless, of course, many of these compounds were well equipped. Many of the fortresses that we see were equipped to survive for an indefinite number of years, or they had the ability to sustain themselves. It points to many different possibilities, and we're going to be exploring exactly what we believe happened towards the end of the Fourth Era civilization, because we do have many clues, as I said, that indicate that they were facing an existential threat. Now, looking at the Independence Hospital in Independence, Iowa, we see probably one of the most finest constructed facilities or survival compounds. And I wanted to zero in on this one because we did actually do an on-site exploration, and it's probably the best example of a reset compound that had a lot of effort put into it. And looking initially, what we're told is that the exterior walls of this facility are constructed of what's called Anamosa limestone. Now consider this. The official history tells us that this was originally built as a mental asylum in Iowa in the 1870s. And there was a vast need for it because the original asylum in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, which is in the southeastern portion of the state, was overcrowded. So somehow they managed to build not just this main administration building, but this entire compound with its own power generation capability and ability to live off the grid. Yes, in the 1870s, we're told, although, of course, the official history will tell us that the subsidiary buildings came later, with this sort of interior on it. Does this really make any sense if they're going to put this kind of effort into an asylum that they have a rapid need for? Or does it make more sense that this was either built from the ground up to be a reset compound, or perhaps this was some sort of wondrous hotel or retreat in the Fourth Era civilization that was repurposed into a reset compound, and then after the reset it was repurposed again into an asylum. Indeed, when you look at many of the images and you see just how well constructed the interior of this building is, having this sort of theory suddenly explains a lot of these conflicting aspects that we see with these mental asylums. And you could apply the same paradigm to universities, civic centers, any sort of compound across the land. There's also the underground aspect. Considering how the underground is facilitated in the Independence Hospital or the Independence Asylum in Iowa, it makes a lot more sense that someone would use this to try to facilitate their survival, that there was some reason that they couldn't be outside or above ground. This compound actually gives you the ability to attend to both. You can be above ground or you can be below ground, and you have the capability to survive whatever threats that you're facing. When you look at the size and immensity of the Independence Asylum in Iowa, it's not just the fact in how well constructed the main building is that strikes you. You also find out just how much territory this is really taking up, how much ground and how much area that they have for this entire compound. And when you visit it in person, you can actually witness just how well constructed it is. Now, I don't know for sure. Was it originally a structure in the Fourth Era that was repurposed to be a reset compound? Or was it something that they put a little bit more time and effort into to construct and make sure that it was going to stand up to whatever threats that it was potentially facing? Perhaps they knew that there was some sort of plasma fire, or dare I say, some sort of sound or energy weapon that was going to be employed, and only a certain type of construction would have been able to stand up to those threats. And yet to this day, when you look at the construction materials, you can see that it matches the fine-tuned construction of the Iowa State Capitol itself. And it was actually built in the exact same time frame according to our official history, and yet it's still standing in total perfection. The structure itself is not eroded in any way, shape, or form. And we're well aware that this far north in Iowa, it faces challenges from the weather every year. And let's not forget about the tornadoes, the difficult winters, and many other aspects. And it still stands and functions to this day as a hospital. But originally we're told that it was a mental hospital in the 1870s. And there are many subsidiary buildings that support this structure. It's not just the main building. So suddenly, this becomes an idea of a civilization that saw what was happening. A terrifying note that they did have some forewarning of what was about to happen. Perhaps they were involved in some sort of conflict that they realized that they were not going to win, and there were still some aspects within their civilization that had good intentions to try to attempt to allow the population to survive. Or, on a darker note, perhaps most of their leadership was already compromised by some sort of internal corruption, and they merely decided to send the people here, and indeed also to the underground survival catacombs, to be experimented on, or worse, just simply killed. Now, you might be asking, why would someone go to all the effort to do this? It seems if you're going to completely destroy and reset a society, one of the best ways to do it would be to completely disorient the population. And one of the things we have to consider that we haven't, because it's frankly not exactly an optimistic consideration, is that the examinations on the population that were done before the reset. That the dark intentions were employed even before the complete collapse of the Fourth Era civilization. There seem to be a lot of indications that many of the main institutions in the infrastructure of the Fourth Era civilization had already been infiltrated and corrupted. Because if they really had the capability to build these buildings, and they really had the concept of unity within their civilization, then they should have been able to fend off this threat. And indeed, we do suspect that they did win the first conflict, and that was in the second phase of the Fourth Era civilization. We call it Tartaria on this channel, but that's just simply a name association. At the end of the day, we don't know exactly what their civilization was called, or even what language they spoke. And maybe they only spoke one primary language. Or maybe they had an entirely different means of communicating that we don't understand. But we still see these structures standing, and they defy our ability to replicate to this day. Now, you'll have some people that'll argue that, yes, we could achieve building structures like this. Really? Could we? You also need to examine the construction materials when you're on these old asylums, and Independence Hospital in Iowa is one of the best examples, because it's not just the main building, but you have multiple buildings that show more advanced construction techniques that are holding up just perfectly to this day. And on the sidewalk just below where you're walking here is one of the main tunnels that connects the primary administration building to one of the subsidiary buildings. So it's very clear that they put a lot of effort into this structure. And it seems to me that this was something that was built from the ground up as a reset compound. Now, I could be wrong, but the fact that there's so much thought put into the infrastructure, the layout, and the life support capabilities for this particular compound, it does support those conclusions. And it suddenly comes across as a more darker aspect for what's really behind these reset compounds. There's also the example of St. Coletta, one of the channel's very first explorations, and now that I go back and consider that with different eyes and what we've learned in our explorations, I realize that St. Coletta was another reset compound. Perhaps not as well constructed as the one in Independence, Iowa, but it seems to have been designed from the ground up as a reset compound. Because it does have its own power source, it does have its own ability to live off the grid. We're told that it was founded by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi and was originally supposed to be a school to assist with developmentally challenged children. But we can see when we look at the exploration footage that there are many different structures that show many different construction styles. Now, is it possible that when it was repurposed into a school to support and assist developmentally challenged children that they added a few buildings with the fifth era construction capabilities? Absolutely. Does that happen in every single university and every single compound that were originally survival compounds or reset compounds? You better believe it. Because everywhere you look, you can see different forms of construction. You can tell where the old world buildings really are. So these reset compounds serve a multitude of purposes for us now as we conduct these explorations and try to put together the pieces of what we had with our fourth era civilization going into the fifth era civilization. You have, in a very relatively confined geographical location, examples of different types of buildings. You can see true old world buildings, but then you can also see more of the newer buildings. For example, if you go to a university, you'll find that a university that still has its old main building standing tends to be the nicest, most beautiful, and most bona fide old world building on the institution. But then they have newer buildings that they build. The brutalist architecture buildings, which is where they tend to house the history department in their university. So it suddenly answers many of these questions, and this theory does address the fact that we do have reset compounds that are all over the land. And wherever you are, whether in the United States, Australia, Southeast Asia, Europe, it doesn't really matter, you can find examples of these compounds. Now, they do have different aspects to them, and they may be laid out in different ways. But the baseline aspect of it and the repurposing of these compounds in the fifth era seems to be something that's reflected across the land.
If you reside in any of the great cities of the world or the land, whether it's Paris, New York City, Beijing, many others, you're familiar with the subway system. Of course, if you reside in Los Angeles, you're not familiar with the subway system, and you're confined to the rigors of driving on the 210, the 405, the 110, or heaven forfend the 5. Whatever the reality of your existence, though, you have to admit that the subway has a tremendous infrastructure signature to it. In other words, there was a lot of excavation done to dig out these immense caverns that the subways operate in. Some people really enjoy subways, such as General Katana. But whatever your thoughts are on subways, you have to admit that there was a lot of effort that went into their construction. Do we really think about how long these subways have been around? Because we see that, such as in New York City, the subway system is critical, especially if you want to bypass that surface traffic. And of course, the mainstream tells us that the reason there's no subway in the great city of Los Angeles is because the car companies conspired to keep it from happening. Only in Los Angeles, not in any other city, so I guess their plan didn't work out that well. Whatever the situation, when you look at the subway, though, you can't help but notice that there is a lot of infrastructure that's required to operate a subway, even when it's not operating underground. And how old is this infrastructure? Well, when you look at many of these building stones, you can see that they appear to be much older. What's the real story, though, behind the subway? When did it really start? What does the official historical account tell us? And what does this really tell us about the future of travel?
Well, when we look at some of the images of the open subway areas, we can see the same precise architecture and the geometrical effort that went into establishing many of these arches in this particular subway tunnel. And whichever city that you happen to be in, you have multiple accounts of most of their initial subways starting in the 1890s to the 1910. Ah yes, that 20-year period when so many wonders were accomplished. It also happens to be that same period when we had the advent of heavy machinery. Because no matter how hard people or animals worked, there was no way you were going to excavate this amount of material. There's even some accounts that say that the initial subways in New York City required excavation of 12 miles worth of dirt. Now, granted, there's no pictures of dirt piled up 12 miles high, and you're probably not going to find any, which we could understand why. But we really have to ask this question. What kind of effort went into this? And when we look at these photographs that we have of the construction of the subway, we see many peculiar details that we certainly have to question. For example, does it look older than it really is? Why does a lot of the basic infrastructure and construction materials for establishing the subway appear so old, even though it's so new? This entryway here is very elaborately decorated. Is it possible that these subways might be much older than we realize, much as these buildings and structures that we explore? And why is it we always have to write these dates on these photos? Whether it's 1906, 1913, 1907. I mean, am I really looking at the construction of a subway here, or have they merely torn up the street just to get at these pipes? Because if the photo caption tells me that they're constructing the subway, well, then I'm probably going to think they're working on the subway. Is that really the situation, or is there something else going on? The other thing I find interesting is that when we look at a lot of these photos, we don't see examples of this incredible heavy machinery that was used to excavate it. Now, I'm not saying it's not present, merely that it's not displayed in many of the photos. Well, perhaps because it was so new, it needed to be kept secret. Of course, you see other strange photos that provide other pictures of the construction of the surface area of the subway or the railway. We will look at the rise of the railway within the United States especially because it's quite an amazing achievement. It's considered part of that American exceptionalism. Now, whether that's just a perception or a reality is certainly up for debate, but what's going on back here? We have this very interesting structure in the washed out portion of this old photograph. When you look at the subways, though, you can see that there are examples that would allude to the construction, but example here, this is supposed to be a subway construction photo, but it almost looks like we have a trolley going by, and the only thing I actually see them doing in this photograph is merely working on the surface and the tracks. Now, of course, you could say, well, they're establishing the initial subway. But it's all in the title, subway. It's underground, and that's what it's known for. The whole point of the subway in a place such as New York City is it enables you to bypass all the surface traffic. And indeed, it's essential if you're going to get from the north side of Manhattan Island to the south side of Manhattan Island in a reasonable amount of time. Yes, you can take a taxi, but you're going to be banging around for quite some time. It's much more efficient to take the subway. And in California, it's much more efficient to take the 210 and sit in lanes of traffic when you're California dreaming or California nightmaring, whatever the situation may be. Are we really to believe, though, that this is the actual excavation of the subway? Pickaxes and shovels and people work so much harder. The animals work so much harder, too, in the 1890s to 1910, even though they also had that excavation equipment. There's also the situation with the pneumatic tunnel under Broadway that they talked about constructing in 1870 to 1873. And we even see examples of pneumatic message tubes. There was even one shown in The Simpsons when Mr. Burns wanted to talk to Pete Porter in Pasadena, which just happens to coincidentally lay off the 210 to this day and is the cause of much of the traffic jams there. I'm sure it's another coincidence. Here's another one of these images, though, where you get the impression that the infrastructure appears to be much older. How old are these pipes? How old are these bricks? When was this ribbing, if you will, actually established? How was it constructed? Why does it already appear so old? Well, here's the answers you'll get. Because it's very well documented that black and white photos make things look a little bit more older. And whenever they built anything new in the 1890s to the 1910s, it already looked old to begin with. Indeed, the rail tracks already looked old. The wood looked old. And you had time to just stand around and pose for photos, even though we're told about how hard people worked, how relentlessly that they worked. And then there's a conflicting account about the actual photographs themselves. But going past all that, I'm just considering the account of the subway system. What's the reality behind it? Is it possible, just possible, that these subway systems were already in existence in some way, shape, or form? Now, I'm not going so far in this exploration yet to suggest that there was some previous civilization that constructed these subway systems. But why do all these images, when we really step back and look at this, give the impression that these subways are actually being dug out? That instead of being built from scratch and excavated, that they appear to be cleaned out. They appear to be repaired and restored. Is that what's really going on? Or is it just merely the fact that there were limitations in what photographs they could actually capture at the time? This is a picture of one of the oldest, and indeed in the Guinness Book of World Records, the oldest subway in the world, constructed in the 1840s, originally as an open area, and then they bricked in the top of it. And this is considered the first quote-unquote underground railroad, if you will. Is that really the case behind it? And imagine the logistical difficulty and the challenges of any point in time, whether it's today or 1890 to 1910, really digging out a subway in the middle of a bustling city. Now, of course, you can look at the historical accounts of something such as New York City, where they had all the issues with having so many horses in the city at the same time. And how does the account of the pneumatic tubes actually fit into this? I almost said tombs, which kind of makes you wonder. All these things that are underground, when it was so difficult to get underground. But of course we can just assume that they could do it because they could also build these incredible structures that we see everywhere across the land. And indeed the portions of the subway or the rail line that runs in the surface. And imagine all the bridges and the elevated areas that they had to construct because, constructing elevated rail lines, that's a very easy process apparently. At least it was in 1890 to 1910. You don't see it happen as much. Not to say we can't do it today, we just opt not to do it. Really nice dome on this particular structure. What exactly are we looking at here, and what is this little structure all about? Is this another one of those special potties that we have, such as the one that we had in Paris? Just to give you an idea of scale, you can look over here at these horses in this cart, which appear to be a little bit closer to the camera. So what exactly is that structure? And then there's also the example of the Canton Viaduct in Massachusetts. Because even when they built the initial rails in the United States, there was a lot of infrastructure that had to go along with it. Trains weigh a lot, and they haul a lot, and therefore they require extensive bridges. There's also the fact that due to a lack of tractive force, trains can't go up slopes, or they require a lot of energy to do it. And when you look at this Canton Viaduct, you can see all the effort that went into constructing this. The finest engineering efforts of the 1830s. What they could do in the United States. Now, granted, no one's building a viaduct like this today because, well, it's just not efficient. And here you can see with the stone that we have, the foundation stone, and it says foundation stone on it, just to make sure you have no misconceptions. April 20th, 1834. Well, they should put a foundation stone, and they should have been very proud of that work. Of course, I'll still ask the question, why don't we do things like this today? For that matter, why don't we even use foundation stones? With a lot of the bricks that comprise this impressive viaduct, they even have the actual mason's marks on each of the bricks. Imagine how much time that would have taken. Were these marks originally part of the bricks, or were they added subsequently? I'm not suggesting any sort of conspiracy, merely asking questions, because you can see there are a lot of massive blocks that went into constructing this viaduct. Consider also the account of how they would have actually formed these blocks in 1830, how they would have transported them in place, how they would have set them so precisely, how much effort would it have really required, because officially there was no heavy machinery available. Then we have this nice little information piece of the Canton Viaduct. I guess they had PowerPoint back in the 1830s, or someone made this subsequently, indeed having Excel in the 1830s. But you never know. Someone might come out and tell you, well, yes, it's very well documented that they had computers in the 1830s, and it's very well documented they had PowerPoint and Excel. Hey, look, I've got nothing against PowerPoint or Excel. It's just intriguing that we transpose the information in that viaduct with modern documents, because it's easy, I suppose. And then we also have no shortage of our drawings, our renderings, that show us the impressive construction of the subway right through the middle of the city. And that's the part that we often gloss over, because how extensive, if there was an existing underground rail system, would it have really been? Why do we have all these references to underground rails through time? And indeed, what's the actual unfolding of the chronology? Because you can see in some of these older photos, we have many of the impressive structures and the streets that have already been established. But how much effort really went into building these subways? And are they really going into the surface here, or are they just simply building on top of the surface? In other words, is it difficult to get the photos, or at that time frame with the limitations of photography, to obtain the photos, to really show the difficult excavation process? I think of the film Escape from New York and the deleted opening bank robbery scene where Snake Plissken and his friend Taylor attempted to escape the authorities of the United States police force. They used an underground rail line to escape from Colorado all the way to San Francisco. And in that particular fictional story, the Underground Railway ran all over the United States. And if you read the book on Escape from New York, it's a much more dystopian world. The Underground Railway was required because of gas attacks on the United States during the war in that fictional story. But the concept, though, of an actual underground rail line that connects major cities and major areas must be explored, because we have no shortage of modern expeditions where they're constantly excavating and exploring older subway lines. At least that's what they officially tell us. But what's the limitations behind it? Does it allude to the fact that there might have been a much more impressive and pre-existing infrastructure system? Or were these blocks really constructed? At least in this particular image, these blocks actually look a little bit newer, perhaps more what we would expect to see. And yes, it is possible to ascertain the difference between what's new and what's old, even monochromatic images in video. I can remember having a black and white TV and watching Star Trek The Next Generation on it, and things still look new even if it's monochromatic. And here we have an example of this underground subway, if you will, in New York, along with the brand spanking new New York Post Office that we've looked at before. And of course, it's just a rendering, but imagine the concept. It gives the idea that there is a possibility that these systems, that this entire infrastructure and this connection of underground railways were actually connected. And even think about that terminology, especially if in the United States. When you say underground railway, oftentimes there is a very particular connotation with it. And so what does it really mean? Also, what's the understanding between the difference between a trolley, a steam locomotive, and the use of rails? Did both use rails? Could both have used the same signature? Or just imagine, if you will, since we're considering ourselves with the future of travel, if you actually had a vehicle that could operate in all manners, that was powered through many different means, and had different means of generating the original power. Then again, what kind of limitations would you have on ground travel? Because, as we'll explore with the trolley later in this exploration, imagine if you had all these options. You had the ability to travel underground, you had the ability to travel on the surface, and then you had the ability to travel on the air, or through the air. And consider the complete lack of limitations on that. Consider the fact that if you had the ability to move materials and improve your logistics, then you'd have no limits in terms of what you could construct. It would actually provide a reasonable explanation for why we have all these unbelievable, at least from our perception today, achievements, whether it's with the structures or even with the underground excavation. But we're just looking at one means right now, because we do have numerous examples of the same kind of impressive architecture underground. And of course, we know that they had to have some capability to excavate the foundations for these great structures that we've looked at. But imagine excavating all this. 12 miles of dirt, or was it much, much more? And again, none of the images that we have really seem to convey that actual account that we have. We're told that yes, they did it. But how did they do it? Digging? Animal power? Or was there more advanced heavy machinery that we just simply weren't aware of? Because there are some conflicting accounts, and you might recall when we did our Panama Canal exploration, we looked at that original steam excavator that was apparently around in the 1800s. You remember that one that Teddy Roosevelt himself was driving and operating. So I don't know, maybe they had the ability to get Teddy Roosevelt to all these subways at the same time, and he personally supervised it. There's also the reality of the fact that there's extensive cave systems that exist, at least across the United States. And would it be possible that these cave systems could be connected? Or, even more absurdly, to the minds of some, is it possible that these cave systems are the remnants of some sort of underground highway? Some sort of transportation infrastructure that existed in the distant past, that parts of it were able to have been accessed more recently, and dare I say even pressed back into service, and then of course using our more quote-unquote modern transportation implements, our current version of the subway, if you will. Just think about all these things, and we're only concerning possibilities right now. But why is it that there's not an entire underground rail network that connects all the major cities of the United States? How much time would that save? How much effort would that save, whether you're talking logistics or the simple transportation of people? And how fast could some of these trains go, hypothetically speaking? What if you had more advanced rail systems that could travel much faster? Now, of course, people always talk about the infinite limitations behind everything, but I always find myself fascinated by the fact that there's limitations when there need to be, and yet there's no limitations when there needs to be, if you follow me. But looking at some of these photos where we always have people just standing around and posing and never smiling for whatever reason, we do have to ask those questions because they're not questions with easy answers. It's almost as though these images that we have, instead of simply answering our questions, always and invariably generate many more questions. And as I've stated, when you do image analysis, you have to remember, the image may be accurate, it may have been altered in some way, shape, or form. Again, no conspiracy is required to explain it. It could simply be an error with the actual processing, or maybe they were photographing something else. Maybe this wasn't the construction or the excavation of this subway tunnel. Perhaps this is merely an effort to clean it that happened after it was constructed. Again, I'm not suggesting any sort of conspiracy because people always seem to think that there's a conspiracy being suggested when in fact none is even being suggested. I guess some people always have it on their mind. And here you see an example of one of those earlier machines that apparently we had. But how mobile would it have been? What power system did it actually operate under? And official history tells us, well, it operated under steam power. Maybe so, but how effective were they? There were also different methods that we have drawings of the way they constructed the subways. Of course, we also have wonderful drawings and artistic renderings of the great pulley system that they used to put the blocks in place in Baalbek in what is today Lebanon. But don't you find it interesting that nobody could ever build a practical working example of one of these pulley moving systems? They couldn't even build a downscaled version of it, let alone the life-size version. So as always, I leave it to you to decide what to make of these images and what the real story behind the establishment of our subway systems are across the land. What are these photos really telling us? And why is it everything always seems to have a difficult origin story behind it? I mean, did they really just have thousands and tens of thousands of workers digging out the subways? If there was a historical account that told us that they managed to move 12 miles worth of dirt in 36 hours, and they said they did it, would anybody question it? Are there accounts that we have of certain incredible feats being done in a very short amount of time, currently, that no one questions? And what were the limits behind human labor and horse labor that we have? I mean, look at these carts. This is what they show us in this image, and this is what they incline to us, was the method that they used to cut out these subways. But then we have conflicting images such as this that show more advanced machinery, apparently. So what was really going on? Were they using a variety of different methods? Or was it the fact that they actually found a lot of this machinery, to include the excavation machinery? And that's how we actually explain the presence of these incredible subways. But what are your thoughts? Why didn't we ever follow up with the pneumatic tube? Why didn't they really construct an underground rail line in the United States or in other nations? Or did they? The 1800s, a century with lots of development and technological innovations along with conflict and vast social changes. We have so many clues from this particular century. Today we're going to explore the strange events of the 1800s.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
So the first event we'll look at is the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. At least that's what the official history tells us. The Napoleonic Wars are interesting because we start the century off with a vast series of conflicts, primarily centered in Europe, although it should be noted that these conflicts occurred across the land and the sea. Indeed, if you ever watched Master and Commander, that ship battle was set around South America. We see many different depictions, though, of Napoleon, and in the past, the channel explored the concept of Napoleon being some sort of reset commander who decided to go against the grain and try to establish himself as a leading authority figure. There are many oddities about this conflict, though, including the ability to defy logistical limitations. Now, what's interesting about the Napoleonic Wars is they occurred after the initial start of what we're told is the Industrial Revolution. It was also the first attempt at nations to engage in mass mobilization or conscripting very large armies. And these armies they were somehow able to sustain because we're told that the Industrial Revolution had improved agricultural capacity. Napoleon was a bit of a maverick character, and the official history says that, and I suspect that what the true account is, if Napoleon did exist, is that he's a bit of a maverick character as well. Yet in the recent movie that we saw, Napoleon looked anything but interested in whatever he was doing, and of course that's just the creative choices of the movie, which I found rather interesting. And we certainly know that Joaquin Phoenix is a great actor, but when you contrast that with some of the images that we have in Napoleon, we certainly see a vast difference. We're led to believe by the official historical account that Napoleon was a very charismatic figure, and he was very engaging, and he was also a military genius. And yet in the film, we find out that the love of his life, Josephina, was his main concern, although it should be noted that when she was seducing him, he looked like he couldn't be even more disinterested. But again, creative choices in the movie. Yet in many of these other images that we see of him, he is this very inspiring commander, and he managed to unify France during a time of vast social change and revolution. Of course, it led to a very bloody conflict, and for whatever reason, the most interesting thing about the Napoleonic Wars is, once the conflict ended, Napoleon was not imprisoned, he was not executed for starting wars that killed millions of people. He was simply sent away, initially to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean, where he was allowed to live in comfort. He escaped from the island and started another war, and was defeated yet again. And so he was exiled, this time to St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic, the southern Atlantic, in one of the most remote locations on Earth. Yet, of course, they still gave him a nice mansion to live out his days in. Now imagine if the guy from World War II with the mustache had ended up like that. Imagine if they'd given him some nice retirement villa after World War II in some South American nation. I wonder how well that would have been received. Many questions, though, about the Napoleonic conflict, and many conflicting accounts, and I'm not here to lampoon the movie. I've done that in other explorations. I just find the creative decisions interesting, and we know that everyone who was involved with the film was very creatively inspired, and there were great performers. It should be noted that we do have some images of soldiers dressing up in uniforms from that particular time frame, although what the authenticity of these actual photos are is left to the imagination. I'd imagine a uniform like that would get a little warm, especially in the summer days going across Europe, but you never know. I mean, at least you look really cool and you've got many different aspects to your uniform. So that's the Napoleonic Wars. Let's go to the year without a summer, 1816. The year without a summer, the eruption of Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia, which caused the entire area and sky of the land to be blanketed with ash, and as a result it reduced the sunlight reaching the land and caused a vast drop in temperatures, and as the title implies, it was the year without the summer. Is that really what transpired, though? And here we have the comparison of different volcanoes, and Mount Tambora is one of the biggest in recorded human history in terms of cubic miles of ejecta. Nice word there, ejecta. And what we're told is that this eruption caused an entire layer of volcanic ash to stop the sun from penetrating, and it greatly disrupted the seasons. Oddly enough, though, when you try to corroborate this with local accounts and news and history at the time, It's a little bit of a conflicting account because it seems to affect some areas more than others, and certainly we can make that conclusion that that's always the case when we have an event such as this. There's different aspects of artwork, and it should even be noted that this Year Without a Summer even influenced Mary Shelley to tell her little story about Frankenstein, which endures to this day. What really transpired, though, with this Year Without a Summer? Is this exactly what happened and why? Or was this because of other causes and other events? Is this because this eruption was actually something else that happened that changed the nature of the landscape? Indeed, one of the recurring challenges that we have, according to the official history in the 1800s, is the vast changes in weather. Although what's interesting is that we're told that there was a little bit of a cold period that supposedly ended in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and yet you'll find later that we have a recurrence of cold periods throughout the entire century, from 1800 to 1899. We have many paintings that show us that there were great hardships as a result of this Year Without a Summer. We're told that there were many lives lost because of famines due to the crop losses. We're also told that there were other complications. And yet, oddly enough, as I said earlier, when you try to actually compare and contrast many of these accounts that were contemporaneous from this time frame, they're very conflicting. It seems as though this disaster was felt in some areas more than others, and as I've said, there's nothing odd about that. That's entirely possible. But where the oddities come into play is some of the observations that you have of what was really occurring at that time. Changes of observations in the sky, changes of actual crop yields, and the true effect of this Year Without a Summer. One thing that's interesting is you would think that this would have a great crippling effect on the nascent United States as a nation, as the United States had just come out of the War of 1812 and was still a relatively new nation. And yet, it does not appear to have been negatively affected by this Year Without a Summer. What do you think this event was, and what was really going on, and why do we have so many conflicting accounts? And now we go to the New Madrid earthquake in 1811, the greatest earthquake recorded in North America. And oddly enough, near Missouri, New Madrid, Missouri specifically, and yet we're told that very few people died. A very horrific earthquake that is even reputed to have caused the mighty Mississippi to flow backwards. Now again, this is another questionable event. What exactly was going on? Was this just a random earthquake? And of course, as you can see, we have all of the plaques that tell us exactly what happened, and we shouldn't question the plaques because nobody would actually put the money to put up things that aren't true or didn't really happen. And there's no doubt that something happened, and we're told that it was a magnitude 7.2 earthquake in New Madrid, Missouri, and the effects were felt everywhere. Yet, oddly enough, no loss of life, but vast damage of many structures, and don't you find that interesting? So, if there weren't a lot of people living there, then what structures were actually damaged? Well, again, just don't think about it too much. We have a historical account, and we know that it was a very terrible earthquake, and even though we have plenty of first-hand accounts of the Mississippi flowing backwards and many other odd observations from the time frame, what do you think the New Madrid earthquake actually represented and what was going on? The New Madrid fault line, which we're told is still active, although it hasn't really been active since this earthquake in 1811. And certainly if there were any tremors or earthquakes that have occurred, we'd hear about it. The revolutions of 1848. The revolutions of 1848 revolved around social change, ostensibly centered in Europe, although it seems as though it occurred across the land. And what we're told is that the people had grown tired of being under the rule of monarchs and other difficult situations and the authoritarian rules that they employed in Europe at that time. And therefore, many of the people in the working classes decided to rise up and rebel against their monarch governments and many of the other authoritarian regimes that were going on at the time. Now, the official history tells us that this period of uprising was very bloody, and officially what had happened was that the revolutions were put down by the monarch governments at the time. Although on a longer timeline, what ended up happening was certain individuals such as Otto von Bismarck and what would become the nation of Germany, they did give concessions to the desire of the citizenry to actually have more rights. At least that's what we're told. And it's a very odd account. What was really going on? Was this really a grassroots social revolution that occurred in 1848? Or was this something else? Because it's interesting to note just how many years in the 1800s were actually filled with conflict. External conflict, internal conflict. And yet, oddly enough, none of these nations ever seem to have any issue with mobilizing their vast military resources or even logistically sustaining them, whether they were on expeditionary campaigns across far seas or whether they were fighting their own citizens in an internal conflict or a quote-unquote civil war, which we've talked about quite extensively on the channel. But what did these social revolutions really point to? And did these leaders really actually represent the desires of the people, or were they simply giving the people what their desires were? The revolutions were put down, but since they were called revolutions over a long enough timeline, they were considered successful. So even in the historicity of these social revolutions of 1848, we have a conflicting account. The governments prevailed and put down the armed insurrection, as it were, but the desires and the aims of the people to actually achieve a greater set of freedoms, or let's be honest, it was actually liberties that they were looking for, because when you operate in a society, you only have liberty, you don't actually have freedom. And they had achieved some of the liberties that they were looking for. Although this didn't stop many people from emigrating to the United States from many of these nations where they felt oppression, and there were other issues that were going on. We can refer to many isolated instances of people that simply didn't have enough to sustain themselves, such as the potato famine in Ireland. And there's many other examples. The artwork from this period reflects a very brutal conflict, and we see a lot of siege battles, and we see many great assaults that gives us the impression that this was a much more brutal conflict. It's also intriguing to note some of the wondrous architecture that we have that was already available in the 1800s. It's yet another one of these major events from the 1800s that causes us to question what was really going on. The 1800s population bomb, namely in the United States. We look at how fast the population growth occurred in the United States, and we have a separate exploration on that. But across the entire lands, we're told the population didn't really grow that much. And yet, once again, you have conflicting accounts. And as we ascertain, the population of the United States itself grew over 1,000% from 1800 to 1900. And then we have certain United States cities where the population grew 200,000% in a 100-year period, such as Seattle from 1860 to 1960. So again, what was really going on? We have many accounts, especially in the United States, of vast population growth. It just feels like you're on a ride and they're constantly revising things. The orphan trains, 1850, well, did they ever really stop? That's certainly debatable. The odd thing about the orphan trains, which we've explored extensively on the channel, is it seems to be a redistribution of population, or as we speculated when we did the initial explorations, it seemed to be a diaspora of children, moving them out and spreading them out from where their original homeland actually was. Now, we're told that there were very benevolent and altruistic reasons for doing this. We had children who were stuck in the cities, although it just really seemed to apply to New York City and not all the cities on the United States eastern seaboard. There were also accounts of the orphan trains occurring in other nations across the land. And while the initial impression is that this only applied to one particular social group or nationality of children, it actually applied to all groups of children, if you do a little bit more looking and investigating in terms of what actually happened. But we have children that were spread out all across the land in many different locations, and the reason I put the question mark in terms of not knowing when this ended is who's to say that this really ended, as we still have orphans from current conflicts who get spread out to different lands. Now, it may be true that this is for an altruistic purpose, and we're legitimately trying to help these children. You can find no shortage of public broadcasting specials where they have veterans of the orphan trains who are interviewed, and they talk about how wonderful their experience was, and the family that adopted them treated them very well. And I have no doubt that that's the case, but it's just odd that we have this very positive image of children that were, in many cases, taken from their families, their rightful families, as there's many cases of the one parent that was still alive in the 1800s, and the children were taken away from them and then sent around to other areas in the country. Was there something much more insidious going on? And the orphan trains is another one of those great examples from the 1800s that there seemed to be a lot more going on than what the official history tells us. One of the real purposes of this exploration, though, is I'm looking to detail some of the evidence that we have in the mainstream account that enables us to construct our theories in terms of what really happened. Now, at the end of this exploration, I'm going to go back and I'm going to say exactly what the mainstream tells us in terms of doing this, because only two types of people are allowed to really ascertain what's actually going on in the land, and those people are scientists and historians. They're the only ones who can tell you if you're in a conspiracy, and you may get spun around and thrown around and you're not really sure what's going on. Victoria to the USA, 1800 to 1900. In the 1800s, we had what was called the Victorian era in the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, as it were at the time, and that was the time when they said that the sun didn't set on the British Empire. And indeed, the British Army was second to none in the world, at least according to the official history. And they had a lot of ability to project military capacity across the land. Although the situation in Great Britain after the Industrial Revolution is conflicted, we have numerous accounts of child labor and very difficult labor conditions, and that was part of what led to some of the social revolutions that we talked about in 1848. We also have a very conflicted account of society. We have a great group of haves and have-nots, and this actually reached its culmination point in some of the writings of H.G. Wells when he posited that the class division would lead to separate evolutionary paths on humanity. Ah, yes, evolution. That's always a good one to consider, where they ended up in his novel The Time Machine, the workers becoming the Morlocks, or creatures that lived underground for hundreds of thousands of years, and the Eloi, or the descendants of the people that lived the Victorian lifestyle of being the higher class. Of course, people say that H.G. Wells didn't know that the middle class would develop. Queen Victoria is an interesting character, as most individuals of monarchy are, and we're told that she actually reached her Diamond Jubilee, one of the few monarchs to do so. We also have many other accounts of what life was actually like during that time frame, and while you have the great Victorian parties and many well-dressed people, you also have these accounts of very unfortunate labor conditions and slums that are all over the place. Yet oddly enough, during the same time frame, you also have accounts of housing being constructed across Great Britain and in Scotland, where many of these tenements managed to endure to this day. The challenge was, though, in the 1960s when they began new urban development programs in places such as Scotland, they didn't exactly know what they're doing, at least that's what the official history says, and so they ended up displacing many people and putting them into large tower residences that didn't exactly work out so well. There's a little film from the late 90s called Ratcatcher which depicts this quite well, and naturally it stars Tommy Flanagan. And then the Victorian time frame and the British were supplanted by the United States, the nascent nation of the United States, which became a world power. And the event which official history tells us that prompted that was the Spanish-American War. And we just looked at the wreckage of the USS Maine, which was sunk in Cuba by supposedly the Spanish, because Cuba was a Spanish possession at that time. And the United States got drawn into the conflict, or rather incited the conflict, depending on your view of history. And the United States engaged in what they called a splendid little war against Spain, and as a result, Cuba was liberated from Spain and became its own nation, and the United States acquired numerous colonial possessions, even though the United States was not supposed to be a nation that was interested in acquiring colonial possessions, namely the Philippines, which would go on to play a very significant role during World War II. It's very odd, though, to consider how the United States in just 100 short years had gone from being a nascent backwater nation to becoming a world power. And many historians agree that the Spanish-American War was when the United States had become a world power. Suddenly, it had managed to master the aspects of the expeditionary military approach, it built a navy overnight, and it also began to employ a national army. To what we have today, where the United States is the only military that actually divides up all the known lands into geographical areas of responsibility called combatant commands. And it seems that without a doubt that this transition of power, or at least the overt exercising of military power, was complete at the end of World War II, where the United States would be the primary practitioner of military campaigns across the land. Many of the battles from the Spanish-American War are very interesting to consider, whether you're looking at the battles that occurred in Cuba or in the Philippines. It's an odd comparison of naval actions with land actions, and whether you're looking at the exploits of Admiral Dewey or Teddy Roosevelt himself, you have this odd theme with the United States military where it seems that adventurers are always very successful. And yet you compare and contrast that with some of the earlier failed American military adventures, especially in the War of 1812. And here we have Teddy Roosevelt himself giving a very rousing speech to one of the oddities that occurred after the Spanish-American War, the Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet was supposed to be a showcase of the new American military power, at least in the Navy, and we're told that Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and whose face adorns Mount Rushmore to this day, was a proponent of utilizing naval power. And indeed, naval power was considered one of the most threatening aspects to world peace, as there was the Washington Naval Treaty. Again, this is all the official history. Although isn't it odd that many of these treaties merely serve to encourage, or at least we're told encourage, more innovative approaches to military problems? Perhaps the most interesting aspect, though, in the change of power from the United Kingdom or Great Britain to the United States is just how seamlessly it seemed to happen. And you can really look closely at the development from the Spanish-American War in 1898 to the end of World War II in 1945, and really look at the official strength of the Navy and the military, and then also in what geographical areas both the nations were applied in. It went from the sun never sets on the British Empire to the sun never sets on the presence of the United States military. And whether it's a base or the vast naval presence of the United States military, that all seemed to have its incipience in the use of the Great White Fleet. And here you can see these were the ports of call, and isn't it odd that there weren't many ports of call in Europe at that time? Because you would think they would want to show off the Great White Fleet to nations such as the United Kingdom and Germany. And of course, we have no shortage of our great plaques that tell us exactly what happened, and the interesting historiosity of the Great White Fleet, and where it was applied and where it wasn't applied. There's no shortage, though, of documentation and photographs and articles and plaques written about the Great White Fleet. It's quite intriguing. It's intriguing to think that the Great White Fleet occurred right after the World's Fairs. And now we look at technology. The technological developments of the 1800s are very intriguing. From photographs to telephone to the car, electric telegraph, the vast railway networks, especially in the United States, that the United States managed to apply more rail networks than any other nation, and x-rays, underground railroads, sewing machines, rubber tires, and of course, the public flushing toilet. So you see right there all these technological innovations in the 1800s which brought about modern life. Now, of course, we have some other looks at history that suggest that perhaps there were more technological innovations. Now, there's no official documentation of a television from the 1800s, but it should be noted that there are a lot of rumors of it. State capitals, 1800 to 1899. And we've done many explorations of state capitals, and I always find it interesting that nearly half the states in the United States still have their original state capitals from the 1800s. And they're very gorgeous and impressive buildings, and they're standing quite well to this day. And there seems to be no issue with the maintenance of these buildings, although we'll have conflicting accounts in terms of how well constructed they were. Apparently there was no issue with building a beautiful state capitol in Denver, Colorado in the mountains in the 1800s, and it still stands to this day. We've looked at the Capitol in Connecticut, another one of the most beautiful ones, and in my humble opinion, it compares very closely with what we consider as building number one in our explorations here on this channel. But when you look across at all these different state capitals and you see the similar designs, it's intriguing to think that all these state capitals were built at the same time as many of the county courthouses across the land, with very intricate construction and great details, such as the state capitol here in Springfield, Illinois. And was Springfield the home of the Simpsons? I don't know. They made several allusions to it. We'll have an upcoming exploration on that one. There's state capitals everywhere, though, that give you the impression of great portal windows, wondrous domes, and very interesting construction material. When you go to assess it, you'll be told it's a combination of sandstone, limestone, and of course, I couldn't resist throwing in building number one, the Iowa State Capitol. Even its construction material is quite intriguing, and when you view it on the inside, you definitely get the feeling that you're not in any sort of state capitol, but you're in a palace. And wherever you look at these state capitals, you'll see the similar construction stylings, the pediment, the dome, the great columns, the pillars that are built in the wall, and then of course they're always on hills. And wherever you are in the land, you'll find that there's never any shortage of the construction capabilities. There are certain aspects that match, and yet there are many nuances that show off in many of these wondrous state capitals. And keep in mind, we're looking at only the state capitals that were specifically constructed in the 1800s. We have a couple beauties that were supposedly constructed in the 1700s, and then we have quite a few in the early 1900s. And yet they all seem to be constructed from the same time frame when you compare some of them. And it's very odd that the ability to lay out these wondrous state capitals seemed to end for good around the 1930s, although really you could say it was around the 1920s. New York State Capitol is always very interesting, as you would expect to see a traditional dome, and we don't have that. We have what looks to be a wonderful mansion, or maybe another home for the Vanderbilts. I'm just saying it looks that way, I'm not suggesting that. And yet, wherever you are in the land, you can always find that these state capitals from the 1800s are going to endure for all time, and they give great inspiration in terms of their construction capabilities, whether they have a dome on top or not, or a pediment, or they're slightly different styles. There are different styles when it comes to the 1800s, and yet so many things that seem to be the same. It's a complex situation of similar architecture, and yet we're supposed to believe that all this occurred in the 1800s, along with all the great courthouses. And let's not forget the wondrous state capitol in Austin, Texas, something that quite frankly exceeds the capital of the United States, not just in terms of its space, but its location, its overall beauty. And wherever you look, whether you're in the smaller states of Vermont or New Hampshire, you'll see that the same stylings of the state capitol are not lost. And even in Wyoming, when they just had cowboys and settlers and prospectors, they were still able to design and erect a very impressive state capitol. And I'm sure there's no shortage of talented architects to be found. The World's Fairs from 1851 through 1900. The World's Fairs are one of the interesting elements of exploration that we do when it comes to this alternative research, because these represent the fact that something strange was going on in the 1800s. Yes, the telescope from the Chicago World's Fair, which to this day you can still go and see in an observatory off Lake Geneva in Wisconsin, where it ended up. We have many wonderful showcasings of buildings from these World's Fairs and odd enough exhibitions of great technology, because even though this was nascent technology, it seems as though the people managed to adapt very quickly. The beautiful Crystal Palace, the mobile Crystal Palace from the original World's Fair. Yes, quite intriguing that they managed to produce all this glass in a record amount of time, and then they managed to move it because building it wasn't good enough. Gotta give Great Britain credit though. All their wondrous old world infrastructure, it's mobile. But unfortunately, the Crystal Palace is no longer with us, as it caught fire in the 1930s, and we'll be doing an exploration where we're going to look a lot more closely at this particular Crystal Palace. How exactly does a structure such as this catch on fire? Well, just don't ask, okay? We just know it happens. And here you can see the unfortunate devastated remnants of the Crystal Palace, although it looks like the tower came off pretty nicely. I wonder why they tore down the tower. Well, because the main structure was gone. The gold rushes of 1849, 1896, gold rushes to California, gold rushes to Alaska, the Klondike, the Yukon, all the unique areas that seem to draw vast amounts of people. I wonder why we don't have gold rushes to this day. Oh, that's right, we don't need to have gold rushes. We have cryptocurrency rushes, and you can just do those from the comfort of your own computer. You don't need to get on a really uncomfortable boat and go to some unfortunate area that has no development whatsoever and no logistical capacity and decide to go prospecting for gold. And indeed, the official history tells us that no one came up successful when they were looking for gold. But we do have these interesting photos that show this vast arrival of ships in ports such as San Francisco. Now, let's just think about this. Is this exactly what's really happening? Are we really looking at all these prospectors who filled up San Francisco Bay in a very short amount of time? Or was something else being depicted here? A vast arrival of many people from some other area for another reason. And Gold Rush just happened to be a nice little way to explain it. Because even if you had a gold rush, don't you think people would be thinking about the fact that, I'm going to go to an area that is unsettled, uncivilized from my perspective, and look for gold. I mean, granted, Al Bundy did it in the 1980s, and it wasn't too successful, and it turned out that he was merely prospecting for fool's gold. Now let's look at blizzards and freezes of the 1800s, and we talked about earlier how the climate, the environment seemed to change a lot through the 1800s. Officially, we're told that things improved and warmed up through the 1800s, but then we have conflicting accounts of vast blizzards and great freezes, and it wasn't just the year without the summer in 1816. We even have one as late as 1899, where we have vast amounts of snow and very unseasonable cold temperatures that buried many of the cities in the Northeast and even brought strife to the cities in the southern United States, all the way down to Florida, where they were certainly not used to snowfall, and indeed the first image we looked at was snowfall in Florida. Many feet of snow fell, and it wasn't confined to the mountain resorts of Nevada or Lake Tahoe to this day, but they were all over the place. And why is it we have these recurring themes of vast amounts of snowfall? Did this reflect something else? Now, I know I haven't included the Carrington event in this particular series of explorations, and by all means did I not say that this exploration was comprehensive of all the strange events of the 1800s. Let's be honest, there were thousands. But we'll be looking at the Carrington event in a separate exploration because it is quite interesting, and we're told officially it didn't have many historical impacts, and yet other indications show that it did. Back to the weather, though, we can see how the weather affected, at least we're told, the United States especially. And yet again, despite all these great challenges, the loss of many oranges in Florida because of the weather issues, somehow the nation seemed to survive and continue to progress. And indeed, this was at the time when the United States became a world power, because this last blizzard in 1899 certainly didn't stop any of the great advances that the nation was making, and it did not impede its ability to take its stage with the world, especially when it came to World War I, where the introduction of American troops towards the end, we're told, was decisive to bringing about the Allies' final victory. So you have it, many great conflicting events from the 1800s, many strange events that give cause to question exactly what was going on and why. Many people have looked at the 1800s before, and it's a very odd time frame. And indeed, if a time frame that is so recent, at least in the grand scheme of the overall passage of time, has so many questions about it, then we really have to consider, where else do we have questions? What was real and what wasn't real? What happened and what didn't happen? Now, of course, if we consult the mainstream, they have answers for this, and they're going to tell us that we should not be thinking independently about this. And how exactly would the mainstream respond to these separate investigations, these explorations? Well, I think we should consider that to close this particular exploration. How does the mainstream respond to what we do with our alternative exploration? Well, this article might provide some insight. 1800s technology conspiracies behind the era of invention. And here we have the image of the individual in the 1800s looking at a television. Very fascinating. But we're told that it's known as the Age of Progress, the 1800s, the Second Industrial Revolution. I'm surprised we don't have 8 industrial revolutions, to be honest with you. However, a growing trend of conspiracy theories surrounding these inventions prompts intriguing discussions. So they do admit that this is intriguing and compelling. And they talk about the invention of the light bulb, and then they talk about the debate between Hiram Maxim and Thomas Edison. But then they say that Maxim himself, who said he invented the light bulb, was a controversial figure, because Thomas Edison is most certainly not a controversial figure. And by the way, remember, he did invent a version of Portland cement that was very, very useful in constructing certain stadiums, and we explored that in the past. Tesla's wireless electricity suppressed technology. And of course, they detail the efforts of Nikola Tesla to provide wireless technology, but then they say that there were many great obstacles to this wireless technology. Of course, there were no practical obstacles to all the other developments in the 1800s, such as the telegraph or the rapid construction of railroads, where none had existed. And when you can move 11,000 miles of track in 36 hours and change the gauge on it, why would there be any practical obstacles? Certainly not. The telephone patent race, and then finally our conclusion, decoding the conspiracy. While these 19th century technology conspiracy theories are captivating, they often reflect our own insecurities about technological control and credit more than they reveal about historical fact. Ah, yes, it's your own insecurities when you question things. That's why. The development of technology is rarely a linear path traced to a single individual. Rather, it's a collective endeavor. Oh, except when it comes to Edison, then it's a single individual, but I digress. By scrutinizing these conspiracies, we can better understand the complex social dynamics that shape technological progress. Yet it's crucial to separate sensational speculation, and you might notice that speculation and well-documented are two of the buzz terms we hear a lot, from nuanced historical understanding to truly appreciate the fascinating history of 1800s technological innovations. So in other words, things are only impossible until they're not, just like Captain Picard said. Well, let's take a look, because we have history and science and the two tend to run together. One of the responses that I received in a reply on the 1980s exploration is one of the elements that showed how far we've come in technological progress since 1980 when Carl Sagan did Cosmos was the detection of exoplanets. Carl Sagan had teased it in Cosmos in the 1980s, and I just thought we would look at how science tells us they actually detect exoplanets. Because are we actually able to see planets in other solar systems that are 25 trillion miles away? And by the way, that's the nearest solar system. And again, that's what science tells us. And what are the techniques that they use? Well, they have the wobbling star that hints at an exoplanet presence. The first planets found orbiting sun-like stars are detected by radial velocity technique. A single star devoid of a planetary system will have its center of gravity located at the center of the star. However, when a planet orbits a star, the center of gravity of the star-planet system becomes offset from the center of the star, causing the star to wobble. That's right. If you see a wobbly star, then it may have planets around it. Now, of course, we don't actually see these planets directly, but we can see a little bit of a wobble in a star. That's 25 trillion miles, and that's the nearest one, or many, many more, because 25 trillion miles is about 4.3 light years. Again, going off what the science tells us. There must be more techniques to detect exoplanets. Astrometry is the method that detects the motion of a star by making precise measurements of its position in the sky. Again, 25 trillion miles or more. This technique can be used to identify planets around a star by measuring tiny changes in the star's position as it wobbles around the center of mass of the planetary system. So again, we don't actually see the planets. We see how the star or the light is affected. And from that, scientists are able to ascertain that there are planets around the star. Because there's no other subspace anomalies out there or random other reasons for why there might be variances in the starlight or these wobbly effects that we have. Look, this is science. They are telling us the truth, and it's very clear that this is not speculation when they show us these images of these planets. Even though they don't actually see the planets, they see the changes in the light from the stars, what we're told. And it should be noted that this is the difference between rampant speculation, which is what we're doing when we actually question what we're told, as opposed to good science and good history. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to be taking a look at Evidence of Tartaria, photo album from the 1850s. And in this particular photo, you see a couple power generators and what looks to be a submarine. Before I get into the presentation, I just wanted to give a little bit of credit. I have seen this photo in other researchers' videos. I believe it was UAP channel, and I think he had some great commentary on it if I'm remembering correctly. But if I'm not, please correct me in the comments. I've got a theme for this video, and it goes against how I usually conduct these videos when I do these explorations because, well, we know that photos can be altered, they can be changed, they might not necessarily be conveying the entire truth. But we're going to look at them today as though they are, and we're going to examine what they're telling us. And going back to the 5 eras theory, what we're really looking at is right here at 1850. Right now, the evidence that I've looked at, my updated theory, is that the reset occurred in 1850, so the first timeline. Right around 1850, either right before it or right after it, that was where the reset occurred, and we're going to be looking at the time frame of photos of the period right after the reset to see if there's any clues or if there's any evidence of a previous civilization existing. I believe that there are plenty of clues, and I also believe that there's even evidence that there are enclaves or survivors of the previous civilization that were scattered around the land, the world, the realm, whatever we want to call it. And I think there are numerous examples of that. So what does official history tell us this photo is? The Chattermanzil Palace wall in India, which was destroyed by mutineers during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. And of course, we already pointed out the amazing Antiquitech, or power generation, features on the building and even on the ship here. We also see some amazing architecture that looks like it's been through something rough. Of course, we'll be told it's just natural erosion, it's difficult weather. And then, yes, I'm not going to overlook it. What looks to be either a submarine or submersible that's potentially washed up ashore here. And we see a lot of junk that's in this little harbor inlet right here, and it's quite remarkable. But what exactly is this? I mean, you see a couple fins. I mean, could this be a submarine? Well, believe it or not, our mainstream history does tell us that submarines existed during this time. Yes, I was a little shocked, but if anybody was big into watching TNT or Turner Broadcasting in the 90s, you might remember a little TV show called The Hunley. It was a made-for-TV movie about a Confederate States submarine that conducted the first successful submarine attack in 1864. It even had Donald Sutherland in it. So I was surprised to do a little research and found out that the USS Alligator was actually the US Navy's first submarine, and lo and behold, it was created, at least I didn't say founded, built in 1862. And it was based on a design by a French engineer because, of course, it'd be a French engineer who'd have something this amazing. And apparently, submarines just seemed to come up out of the blue, and there were practical examples in the 1860s or even the late 1850s. Now, yes, people will tell me, well, what about the turtle from the Revolutionary War? Yes, it was a one-person submersible, and it seemed to be crank and screw driven. But in any event, we do have the wreckage here on the right. This isn't the Alligator, it's actually the Hunley. They did recover the original Confederate submarine, supposedly. Although, if you look at it, it looks more like a torpedo. So, who knows exactly what was going on or what they're telling us? It's just amazing when you really pull apart the official narrative and we're told that, yes, we had submarines in the 1860s, because why not? And down here in the lower left, you can see the plans from the USS Alligator. So, going back to this, not sure if this was actually a submarine, the remnants of the submarine. What I would suspect is if this was just after the reset and the powers that be were resettling many of the areas, they no doubt found a lot of remaining buildings and they found a lot of remaining equipment, whether it was ships or whatever, and of course the technology with it. So this could have been designs that they found, remaining ships or submersibles all over the place that were not destroyed in the reset, whatever it truly involved. And they were able to either extrapolate designs or get working designs going again. Not sure, but it definitely seems to lead to that indication. Let's move on. A group of Gurkha soldiers with their British officer during the Indian Mutiny or Great Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. Now look how well they're equipped and dressed, and you really have to wonder what's really going on here. Is this a legitimate military operation to suppress a rebellion? Or is there something else going on here? If you look in the nature of conflicts, and the real purpose of this video overall is to introduce some other major clues as to how the world responded after the last reset, and what were the methods in which ensuring that the reset stuck and there was no memory of the previous civilization. And I believe there were three approaches. They utilized conflict, and the conflict was masking the destruction of what remained of the enclaves. They used asylums for the people who did not want to assimilate into the new society or the new world. And then they also had indoctrination, which was gradually implemented in education and society and the major institutions. I'm going to do many videos that are going to follow up on those three themes and how they implemented this. But what this picture could be is you could be seeing a picture of the expeditionary force that was sent to destroy one of the enclaves, and then they simply had a different name for it. Oh, they were suppressing the Indian Mutiny or the Great Sepoy Rebellion in 1857. Yes, see, we got a great picture. And yes, I do think there are clues that the U.S. Civil War was the same thing. But there are many conflicts on record that occurred between 1850 and 1870, and in fact, the rest of the 19th century. So all in good time. The inauguration of President James Buchanan at the east front of the United States Capitol building, March 4th, 1857. Well, there's a lot going on in this picture. Oh, I mean, what is this? I can't tell if this is a ladder or what. This is an amazing picture, but yet the quality of it is either eroded or there's something else going on. I don't know. You'd think you'd get a better picture of a presidential inauguration. And for those of us into U.S. history, James Buchanan was the ineffective U.S. president whose poor leadership allowed the United States Civil War to start. At least that's what official history tells us. And of course, you can see on the Capitol building the amazing columns and some remarkable statues and people just standing on the roof. It's always people standing on the roof. They seem to love to show that in these old photos. I guess getting on the roof was the cool thing to do. Of course, you'd never be allowed to do that today in any major event, but back then apparently it was encouraged. And perhaps what we see here is, people moving or the photo being distorted by that. It does give that inclination that there were limits to the technology at the time. Okay, fine, so be it. And then another one of the U.S. Capitol building dome under construction, looking south from the roof of the Senate wing, showing the first row of columns near completion and the cast iron pillars up, 1857. That's cast iron pillars, and then it looks like we have some columns. Although, once again, this photo just raises more questions than it answers, because of course you have the classic vanilla sky, and you'll say, well, the quality of the photo degraded and they just didn't have the technology. Okay, fine, I can accept those arguments. And it looks like we just have a group of workers that are just hanging out and posing, as they tend to do. Just so much mystery when you look at a photo like this, and you have to wonder about it and wonder about this previous photo, because it gives the idea that there's limitations in the technology, but then you have other things going on. You have other things going on that really make you question the legitimacy of it. And who knows how these photos could have been altered. Is this guy like a phantom or something? What is going on here? Strange. But then you contrast it with this seascape with a ship leaving port in France in 1857. And look at the detail in this photo. You can see the clouds perfectly fine. You can see the lighting. You can even see the detail in the water. And so I only included this photo just to show you the difference in quality in these images. Because look at this. This is terrible quality in the image. Okay, it's degraded. They had poor technology. Fine. Okay, we can believe it that, it's poor technology. We've got disappearing people and strange things going on here. But then you get to this photo and you see that you can see every detail in it. I mean, the only thing that's different than this being a modern photo is you don't have the color in it. But you can still get the sense of color. It's just an amazing contrast looking at those three photos. The good old Hagia Sophia, Constantinople, what is now Istanbul, Turkey in 1857. They love to say that 536 was the worst year to be alive. And despite it being the worst year to be alive, it did not stop them from building the Hagia Sophia. A lot of interesting things going on in this photo. Of course, you have this washed out roadway here that looks like it was, I'll just go ahead and say it, flooded by mud or something. Because you can see it for yourself, but I'll just point it out because I can't help myself. And then you have what appear to be, it's hard to tell what's going on with some of these buildings. I mean, were these temporary buildings, or they just look very rickety? And then behind it, you've got the Hagia Sophia and all its grandeur and glory. Built in 536 and completed on time despite it being the worst year to be alive in human history. And there are plenty of videos that'll tell you why that was the worst year to be alive. Yes, indeed. Oh, don't worry about the bubonic plague. That was apparently an easy time. And let's not talk about 2020. Anyways, moving on. San Francisco and the harbor from Stockton Street, containing the portions between Washington and Sacramento Streets, 1856. Its 1847 population was said to be 459. And you want to know something? I think this could be accurate, and let me explain why. So we're told that San Francisco was a small settlement. The official account says that in 1847, despite it being a great natural port, and we know how natural ports can just suddenly build and expand and grow very quickly, and it makes sense because they have access to the sea. Fine, so be it. But they tell us that the population was 459, and it was small because of the difficult terrain around San Francisco. And if you've been to San Francisco, yes, you have a lot of hills around there and so forth. Yet I can believe that they're being honest about this if we consider the fact that all these buildings were there, because I find it hard to believe that they established all these amazing buildings. And if you look at these, you'll see these aren't just wooden buildings. You've got some larger buildings, and I think we see some pillars here and maybe even a dome back there. It's hard to tell, but just amazingly built out. And this is only 9 years after the population was 459. And of course, we know the big event was the gold rush in 1849. Okay, well, the problem with the gold rush is how in the heck did all these people get across the United States? Did they cross the continental United States without the Transcontinental Railroad? When they had Native Americans that were righteously angry at them for invading their land, if we go off the historical account, so they certainly wouldn't be keen to let them pass. Okay, so then they got on a sailing ship, which is what this picture is supposed to tell us, and you can find other pictures from earlier time frames like 1859. Well, how did all these ships get there? They would have had to go around the Cape Horn, South America. And the waters around Cape Horn aren't exactly easy. It's very treacherous. But okay, sure, we'll believe it. And all these people showed up. Well, going back to why I think the population was 459, I believe that may have been the population of the survivors that stayed in San Francisco prior to the reset and tried to survive it. I think they may have been very accurate when they said it's 459. It's a very exact number, too. And you'll see that in a lot of accounts with many cities. And you have to wonder if when the city started off with those original population numbers, like this for San Francisco is just utterly bizarre. This is a great natural port if this was in existence, and it should have been because this was originally a settlement, Spanish settlement, and that culture. And if you watch the Zorro movies, you get an idea of that. How could this have been so small for such a long time? Just an amazing photograph, and I think it tells more of a story. But those are just my theories. I could be completely wrong, and the mainstream account could be correct, or there could be something else going on with our realities that we're not sure of. But that's how I'm calling it right now, and that's the theory that I'm proposing. And Battery Street in San Francisco, California, 1856. So again, only 9 short years later. By the way, you can find more dramatic photos from 1851 where they just threw the city up in just a few short years. I guess all these people who were coming here, all these 49ers, were amazing engineers and builders. And I know it's been covered in many other channels, but just look at this. So here you can get the idea of brick buildings. Very clearly a brick building. Nice little dome or tower adornment. I mean, why not put the decoration? You can accomplish anything in 9 short years. And well, here it is, an actual dome. More pillars and columns and, because they just brought everything with them. It was really just easy. And San Francisco is always a remarkable city. Just look at the detail right here. Everywhere you look, you see it. Yes, I think it tells a very different story than what the picture depicts. And now we'll look at some individuals too. Samuel Morse, the American artist and inventor, standing in a studio with an automatic telegraph receiver, which would record incoming Morse code messages onto paper circa 1857. Yes. Samuel Morse. Interesting character. Looks very regal and looks very, very well dressed. I don't know. Looks like he's ready for the blizzard to come in. I sure hope they didn't take that photo somewhere down south in the summer, but maybe there were some different climate situations going on in Georgia and South Carolina. That's where he posed for this picture because that's the reason why the land was so arid there. Those droughts that could randomly occur. I never witnessed one when I lived there for about 10 years, but that's okay. It's possible I could miss things. I mean, strange weather anomalies going on right now if you're in the United States, especially if you're in the Midwest. So anyway, just to give you an idea of how someone could look and who knows what's really going on here. I always found the telegraph very interesting because we try to say it's how news was spread across the United States. For example, the John Brown raid into Harper's Ferry, the official account tells us that everybody in the United States was waiting with bated breath to find out what happened. And I remember asking, well, wait a minute, how could they possibly know? They didn't have radio back then even. Oh, they had the telegraph. Oh, so everybody went to the post office as they depicted in Little House on the Prairie, and then they waited for the person operating the telegraph to read the messages, and they did this every day? Okay, sure, if you say so. Queen Victoria's visit to the Manchester Exhibition of Art Treasures of the United Kingdom, June 1857. I'm not sure which one's Queen Victoria. Maybe right here. Perhaps one of my viewers in the United Kingdom can correct me on this, but I really included the photo because it's pretty amazing. It gives you another example of being able to photograph a large number of people, despite having limited photographic technology at the time. Yeah, we get a little bit of the phantom effect here, and fine, yes, there's explanations for that, but it's remarkable to me how it just seems to apply in some cases and it doesn't apply in other cases. And the answer will be, well, some photographers had better cameras and took more time and longer exposures. Yes, I'm aware of the technical explanations. But when you go through the different photos, you have to wonder what kind of story is being told, and it's always interesting to consider. Peter Force, American editor, publisher, and historian, served as the 12th mayor of Washington, D.C. from 1836 to 1840, circa 1857. Okay, look, I don't know the guy. Quite a name he's got. I mean, with a name like that, you can get yourself elected mayor anywhere, apparently. Peter Force. I don't know, he kind of gives the impression of somebody who's a thug in some way, or somebody who knows what's going on. And I mean, look at that expression right there. You get some interesting expressions, too, when you look at these older photos. I mean, they certainly didn't smile back then, but yeah, this guy has a borderline leer almost on his face, as though he's plotting something, or he knows something. Or maybe he knows nothing and he's just some older gentleman they decided to take a picture of. I don't know. I never really heard him much in historical context prior to seeing this picture and just thought I'd include it. Cloud study over Paris, circa 1850s. We'll get a couple pictures of Paris. Paris is very clearly a beautiful city. And of course, everyone talks about the romantic connections to Paris. And yes, I understand that. Of course, there was an earlier video featured on this channel where we talked about the catacombs of Paris and a very different presentation of what could be going on there. But I included this one because you get some great buildings, and also it does capture the clouds pretty well. Although oftentimes we see the clouds completely washed out. And yes, there's technical explanations for why that happens as well. But here's a photo that shows you can see the clouds and even some decent sunlight. Paris looking back toward from across the Seine, circa 1857. Again, just look at the amazing build out of Paris at that time. I mean, it almost gives you the inclination that this is the modern city of Paris. I mean, look at the road here. What's exactly going on here? It's like they needed to wash it off like it was covered with dirt. And maybe it was because of all the wagons that were going on it. But just remarkable detail that you see in some of the structures and the traffic on the river. And look at these bridges. They built them during the Middle Ages. Probably built them during the bubonic plague. They would say that because you can build the Hagia Sophia during the worst year in history, and it doesn't stop that. So why would it stop people in France from building amazing bridges when half of the population was dying of the bubonic plague, right? Oh, look at this. You got like this little fairy tale tower back here, in addition to the amazing cathedral and the other tall towers. And just look at the detail of all these buildings. I wonder what this photo would look like if we actually had one in color. And that's something else you have to be careful because, we'll have our good friends artificial intelligence colorizing these photos, but we know that's not what they really looked like. So there might be an entirely different picture to see behind it. Morlaix, I think I'm saying that correct. And looks like we got a group of ladies walking about doing their business. And, again, it looks like the area has just been subjected to some sort of force, and it's hard to say what, because again, I see this nature of the arid land. And then of course people might counter that, well, that's just how it looked. It was dirty. It's a port. It's by some water. Okay, fine. So be it. But you've got some amazing buildings with some detail that you always see hidden all over the place. And it's Europe. They probably built it during the 14th or 15th century, or during the Renaissance. They could do all kinds of amazing things during the Renaissance. So we're told. Nice little tower back here. And clearly, I don't know what this is, but you see some bricks around with it. Looks like some sort of, circular trash depository. I doubt that's what it is, but maybe it's an area to moor ships. Maybe you got one down here. Hard to tell. Ah, yes, the Viaduct de Morlaix. This was built in 1861 to 1863. And look at this. Just an incredible structure that they run trains over. And of course, you get another example of great buildings in this little area, but just a remarkable engineering achievement. And I wonder how that's done. So 1861 to 1863. Hey, at least they say it took them 2 years to build it, and they didn't just throw it up in a month or so. I'm surprised they didn't say that. Well, you can still see it today, apparently. And it looks like it's holding up pretty well. I mean, people can still walk on it, and trains can still run on it. I mean, look at the arches and all the blocks that went into it. 1861 to 1863. Make of that what you will. They could do amazing things in France. Not only did they record amazing buildings, but they could build them too. Got to give them credit. Yes, the Dome of the Rock, a little photo of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem's interesting because when you look at it, you do get some inclinations of perhaps the timeline making a little bit more sense, or at least some of the buildings being a little older. Of course, if you've been in that environment and you understand that just going a couple months can take an extreme wear and tear on buildings over there, just with all the fine dust and particles that constantly flow around. But very beautiful, very amazing detail, a lot of arches right here, and nice little tower here. And of course, many other researchers have covered this amazing structure and the remarkable architectural achievements in it. And there's beauty that seems to have persisted in Jerusalem for years. It's perhaps a place where we could really believe the narrative, because it does look like it, to be objective. Now let's go back to the United States. Quincy Public Market in downtown Boston, 1857. Oh, yes. And here's where we see our amazing large columns that come up a lot in United States architecture. And here we have this nice dome. I don't know, this almost looks like one of the amazing buildings that was featured in one of the many so-called World's Fairs. Anyways, it's just remarkable to see this kind of achievement. And then even down here on the road, you get the idea, or the parking area. Is this dirt? Is this brick? Not really sure. It almost looks like it could be brick here, but I don't know. I'm not there. Got a horse here pulling a cart, but we're supposed to believe that horses and carts and human labor erected this beauty and did it back before 1857, because obviously it was built before the photo was taken, or at least we'd like to think. Got a nice building back here too. And it looks like you've got one of those old style roofs on this building. Boston's got an interesting story to it. And oh, yes, by the way, Boston was the victim of another one of those unbelievable magical fires of the 19th century. Boston in a busy Boston harbor looking north from the State House dome in 1858. And when you look closely in this photo, you can get the details in some of the buildings. I mean, look at this. Really? This kind of reminds me of the interior of the Iowa State Capitol, where they have these amazing adornments over every single door. It's quite remarkable. But when you look carefully, you see the little dome rotundas, you see amazing architecture all over the place. And we can try to buy it with Boston. The city's been around. It was featured prominently during the American Revolution in the previous century. Okay, fine. But even so, it's still the same limitations. Horses, carts, human labor. No heavy machinery, rudimentary cranes, which we saw in the earlier photo. And it's just so much detail that's established in a very large city. It's impressive, however it came to be. Parker House Hotel, possibly in the late 1850s, and you see the same thing. And you'll see this in small towns around the United States and all over the world. But, I mean, look at the roof on this. And the detail on the top of it. And right down here in the entryway. Amazing. Just remarkable. And what are these? Are these gas lamps, or are these powered through some other means? And then you've got some more lamps right here. What exactly is going on? Of course, they'll tell us, well, somebody went around and they climbed in and they lit them every night. Okay, fine. But just a very beautiful photo. Great Eastern, while under construction at London's Millwall Ironworks on the River Thames, November 18, 1857. The size of this thing. It's like they built the Titanic long before the Titanic. What are these people doing right here? And, it looks like you got a couple supervisors here with their top hats on. People were all about wearing their top hats back then. But it kind of looks like they're just standing around. It almost looks like this was something that one of the, we'll just call it recovery crews that was going around, because, you got the gentlemen with the top hats on, and there's always questions to be asked when they appear. They found this amazing ship. They didn't say they constructed it. It'd be funny if they said they founded it. You don't see that with large ships. We had to construct it. Same thing with submarines. I mean, just look at this. I mean, this axis here looks like this is something that they may have built. It was something that we believe that they could do. But just remarkable. And if you look at the Great Eastern, it was a gigantic ship. It didn't really make a lot of sense for building it. And apparently they had a lot of challenge with even getting it into the water. So I'd include that one. Back to the sign in Paris. And here you see more examples of the amazing bridges, some of the remarkable buildings, all the arches, and then the roof work and the detail. And of course, we'll go back to that story that, well, Paris has been around for a very long time. We'll even say hundreds or over 1,000 years. But still, it's just remarkable what you see. And I'm not even covering, the human activity or lack of human activity in some of these photos. I mean, it looks like there could be a couple people on this bridge and some people over here. Not sure. But it's still amazing to consider. An abbot accompanies students visiting the Roman Forum in Rome, Italy, circa 1857. This guy's an abbot. It looks like he's wearing one of those special hats, and just found a kid roaming around the area and said, hey, you're coming with me. I'm going to take a look at this. Look at the forum here. And here's what's amazing. So we're supposed to believe that this is the ruins of the forum and that it just stayed here and hung out here for over 1,000 years and nobody messed with it. Look at that right there. Hexagonal walkway, it looks like. Not sure. But all these societies came and went, all these governments came and went, and during the hardest times of human existence, to include 536, the worst year to be alive, according to many sources, and nobody touched any of this, nobody took this. I mean, they tell us that they took the stones from the pyramids in Giza, and of course you might remember this particular building. It was featured in one of my earlier videos, as it bears a striking resemblance to the dome on the Iowa Capitol, even though the Iowa Capitol was built hundreds of years later. And we won't talk about Trajan's Column. We've already been there. Interesting photo. A cathedral in Baltimore, Maryland, 1856. Yes, look at these. This is definitely something we associate with the United States, with this kind of architecture. And look at this walk that this gentleman is standing on. Just incredible. Nice curb there, too. That almost looks like something out of modern times. And of course, we have another one of these incredible lights that's just sitting there, and one back there, too. Amazing buildings, and It looks like Baltimore, for whatever reason, at least this section of it, was spared a lot of the ravages that came with whatever the last reset was. We even have some trees that look like they're doing well. Another amazing tower. Look at the brick here. I mean, this almost looks like modern brickwork right here. And the stonework. Of course, they tell us it's modern, but we know that the older buildings do have what appear to be better brickwork. But here's a first-hand example of it from 1856. Unless you want to believe that this photo was altered in some way, and I'm certainly open to that discussion. And they all could be altered in some way. So that's why it's interesting to explore them and why I say they provide clues. Construction workers build a new jail in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1857. Well, I think they're being honest right there because, the United States, land of the free, is, well, let's just say the prison industry is quite a large industry, and we have quite a large percentage of the population incarcerated in the United States, the land of the free. But, okay, so this is St. Paul before the United States Civil War, and even before the Dakota War, which was a Native American uprising that occurred in Minnesota during the Civil War. So we're to believe that Minnesota sent a great majority of its population to fight in the Civil War, but then it also had to contend with a Native American uprising. Interesting story. But you've got some of these buildings, and I mean, here we are in Minnesota, built out buildings in St. Paul, and there's some very severe weather there. I don't know if this is a church or an administrative building or what. Looks like it could be either or, but you also get the impression that there are people that are settling in the area too. So, I mean, there are some clues that the narrative could be on point here, and yet there are things that contradict it. Interesting photograph, and you can spend a lot of time looking at photographs just from the settling of Minnesota in that time frame. So we're going to be revisiting this period right after the reset in the 19th century, in the 1850s, and the decades that follow, looking at conflicts, asylums, and indoctrination. But I saw something that I wanted to share with you, so I've included a bonus on this video, the Golden Bridge in Vietnam. Now, I had never heard of this before. I was never aware of this. I did extensive historical studies in Vietnam in my previous career because of the U.S. conflict in Vietnam and also just the ongoing nature of conflict in Vietnam. In 4 decades, Vietnam defeated Japan, it defeated France, it defeated the United States, and it ended it by defeating China. That's what mainstream history tells us. So when I found out about this, and I just happened to see this in random 4K imagery that I typically have playing when I'm assembling the videos, I noticed this image and it just stuck with me. The Golden Bridge in Vietnam, in Da Nang apparently. But just look at this. These amazing stone hands. I'm not exactly sure what they're made of. I haven't been there. And the image just stuck with me, just this amazing vista. I'd never seen anything like this, and I was certainly not aware of it. And I wanted to look into it, and I wanted to share it with you because it's remarkable. And I didn't know the story behind it. And certainly for any viewers who've been to Vietnam, or if I have any viewers from Vietnam, I would certainly love to hear more about the story of the construction of this incredible site. I mean, when I see the detail in these hands, I'm sort of reminded of the detail that you see in Mount Rushmore in the United States and South Dakota. I mean, it's incredible. And I mean, look at this close-up. Look how large this is. And yet the detail in it. I mean, they built this, okay. Who and how? I would like to find out. It's just remarkable and it's gorgeous. It's 2 hands and an amazing view where they established a structure. And here's another angle of it. And I mean, I don't know. I don't know how they built it. I don't know how they did this. It's incredible, though. And need to look into it. I want to see what the story behind this is. And again, I'm inviting viewers if they know of this construction. And I've already done the initial look for construction photos and haven't found anything. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not out there. I just didn't find them on initial search. So if anybody has construction photos of this amazing structure, I would love to see them. So please let me know. No, apparently there's also a castle structure. It looks like a castle in the same vicinity. So